Chapter 1 Daughter of the Nile's Last Breath. In the hush of morning light, where soft winds from the Mediterranean met the breath of the Nile, Alexandria shimmered like a city caught between two worlds. It was not just a capital, it was a dream made of marble and papyrus, of scrolls and sails. Built by Alexander the Great and ruled by his heirs, it was a place where stone columns rose like silent hymns and the sea hummed secrets to white sand shores. Ships from every known world gathered at its great harbour, their hulls full of spices, scrolls and symbols of far-off gods. And towering above them all, the lighthouse of Pharos, a wonder of the world, cast its beam like a guardian eye over sailors and scholars alike. Here east met west in golden halls, the streets buzzed with 1,000 tongues, Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and yet the heart of the city pulsed in quiet reverence. Beneath its surface grandeur, Alexandria was a keeper of sacred things. The library, vast and mysterious, held the memories of mankind on shelves that whispered when the wind passed through. Its scholars walked as if each footstep was a prayer, each word a key to something greater. It was here, in this city of light and silence, that Cleopatra drew her first breath. She was born into a world steeped in stories, where every stone was carved with meaning and every shadow belonged to a god. Her cradle stood not far from the waters of Canopic Way, where mosaics sparkled like constellations underfoot. Outside her window, papyrus reeds bent gently in the breeze, the same breeze that carried incense through temple gates and rustled the pages of ancient texts. Even the sky seemed deeper over Alexandria. Stars lingered longer above the Serapeum and the Temple of Isis, whose priests still lit fires for the gods of old. Yet beneath the majesty was a quiet sorrow. For all its splendour, this city sat at the edge of an ending. Egypt, once the heart of a divine kingdom, had become a stage for foreign hands. The gods still stood, but their temples echoed with fading hymns. And into that hush, into that sacred stillness, a girl was born who would try to hold the sun from setting. The weight of a dynasty. Cleopatra was not just born into royalty. She was born into a bloodline coiled tight with glory and grief. Her name echoed with ancient might. Cleopatra Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy XII. But the crown she inherited was not a crown of peace. It was a garland of gold woven through with shadows. The Ptolemies, Greek in blood yet rulers of Egyptian soil, had sat upon the throne for centuries. Descendants of Alexander's general, they had taken Egypt as their prize. But Egypt, in turn, had taken its toll. This dynasty had known both brilliance and betrayal. Some Ptolemies built temples that rivaled the gods, others tore down their own brothers. It was a legacy of astronomers and assassins, of queens who ruled, and kings who vanished behind velvet curtains. And with each generation the weight grew heavier, like stones added to a sacred scale that never quite balanced. Her father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, was not a strong king. He ruled with more music than might, more coin than courage. Rome's influence had wrapped itself around Egypt like a silken net, and Auletes often paid dearly to keep his throne. His alliances came at great cost, and when the gold ran thin, so did his power. At times he fled the city he ruled, leaving Alexandria to boil with unrest. At others he returned with Roman muscle at his side. Through all this, Cleopatra watched. She learned early that power was fragile, and crowns could be taken as quickly as they were given. The marble corridors of the palace were cold with secrets, rooms where maps of conquest hung beside portraits of long-dead kings. The Ptolemies claimed to be gods on earth, descendants of divine blood. Yet their empire trembled like a candle in the wind. Still, to be born of such a line meant one thing above all: she could not live an ordinary life. From the moment she opened her eyes, Cleopatra belonged to history, and history, like the Nile, flowed in two directions, past and future, pulling her ever forward. A girl among thrones and ghosts, the palace in which Cleopatra grew was no fairy tale. It was a maze of power and paranoia, where footsteps echoed through stone galleries like whispers from the past. Every shadow had eyes, every silence held the memory of something lost. And within its walls, Cleopatra was raised not just as a princess, but as a witness to a legacy unravelling. She was still a child when she began to notice the rift between what was said and what was true. Her tutors taught her about kings and their laws, But her own family taught her something else, about betrayal, ambition, and the art of survival. Sisters who smiled at breakfast could turn cold by nightfall. Brothers who once played in the garden would soon fight for thrones with poisoned goblets and mercenary blades. In this world, Cleopatra kept her eyes open. While others plotted, she studied. While others gossiped, she listened. She was not the eldest nor the most beloved, but she was the one who remembered everything. She watched the movements of the court like a chessboard. She understood that power, true power, did not always wear a crown. It moved in the margins, in the silences, in the soft decisions no one noticed. The corridors were lined with statues of gods, but the real gods were long gone. In their place were human players, wearing divine masks. Cleopatra began to sense the hollowness in the rituals, the way incense drifted in rooms where no true prayers were spoken. She felt the cold space between tradition and truth, and it woke something inside her. Not bitterness, not fear, but a kind of resolve, a soft rebellion. She learned not to trust titles, not to believe in pretty words. What mattered was wisdom. What mattered was clarity. And in her quiet hours she read, scroll after scroll, history after history. The palace had become a tomb for many, but for Cleopatra it was a library, one that taught her not just who she was, but who she could become, learning the language of the land. Among all the Ptolemies, Cleopatra alone chose to speak to the people in their own tongue. While her forebears spoke Greek and heard Egyptian as the language of servants, she leaned in to listen. She studied the language not as a novelty, but as a bridge, one that could connect the throne to the soil beneath it. It was a quiet revolution. For centuries, Egypt had been ruled by foreign kings who stood apart from the land they governed. But Cleopatra, even as a girl, felt differently. She was born of Greek blood, yes, but as her soul was pulled by the Nile, drawn to the rhythms of the sun and the lotus bloom. She did not see Egypt as a prize to be held. She saw it as a story to be continued. Learning Egyptian meant more than speaking new words. It meant walking into a different world. She studied its gods and glyphs, its riddles and rhythms. She learned to speak with priests, farmers, and fishermen in the tongue of their ancestors. And in doing so, she stepped out of the shadow of her lineage and into something older, something deeper. She was not just a ruler, she was becoming a daughter of the land. The people noticed, in marketplaces and temples, in fishing villages and garden courts. The name Cleopatra began to carry not just fear, but hope. She was young, but she was listening. She was of the palace, but she walked with the gods of the river. And though she had not yet taken the throne, the land had begun to respond to her like it would to spring rain, cautious, then blooming. It would be years before her rule began, years before the storms of Rome would descend upon her golden kingdom. But even now, as a girl, Cleopatra had already made her first choice, to be part of Egypt, not just to sit above it. And in that simple act, in learning the language of her people, she planted a seed that would echo through history. In a time when the gods were silent and thrones grew brittle, a young voice began to speak, not in the tongue of conquerors, but in the language of the Nile itself. Chapter 2: Bloodline of Intrigue. The royal house into which Cleopatra was born was not one of calm wisdom or gentle unity. It was a throne forged in ambition and soaked in suspicion. The Ptolemaic dynasty, rulers of Egypt for nearly 3 centuries before her birth, was founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. They were Greeks ruling an Egyptian land, and over time, they became something both foreign and familiar to their subjects. Yet within their gilded palaces and marble colonnades, the family's deepest enemy was never a foreign invader, it was blood itself. To preserve their Macedonian lineage, the Ptolemies had long practiced sibling marriage, a tradition that folded power tightly into the family, but at a steep cost. Brother married sister, nephew married aunt, mother ruled alongside son. These alliances were not forged out of love, but of calculation. Every union a way to prevent outsiders from tasting the throne. But the same hands that passed the crown also held daggers. Behind every royal smile there often lay a scheme. Poison, imprisonment, and exile were not just tools of war, they were customs of inheritance. By the time Cleopatra VII was born, sometime around 69 BCE, the dynasty was already worn thin by internal conflict. She did not grow up with fairy tales or bedtime songs. Her lullabies were whispers of betrayal. Her nursery stood in a palace where portraits of past rulers hung silently, many of whom had been murdered by those they once ruled beside. And this was not history long past. It was recent. Her own father, Ptolemy XII, had survived exile and unrest. His throne had teetered more than once, kept upright not by loyalty but by bribes and Roman support. In this world, Cleopatra learned quickly. To be born royal was to be born into danger. Sisters in shadows. Cleopatra had sisters, and each one was a reflection of the dynasty's sharp edges. Among them was Berenice IV, her older half-sister, whose ambition flared into open rebellion. When their father, Ptolemy XII, was driven into exile by angry citizens, frustrated with his debts to Rome and his corrupt reign, it was Berenice who seized the throne in Alexandria. Young and fearless, she declared herself queen, eager to rule without the shadow of a man above her. But this act of courage, or perhaps desperation, would cost her dearly. Ptolemy XII returned to Egypt with Roman soldiers at his back. Berenice, barely in her 20s, was captured. And as was customary in the Ptolemaic world, the punishment was final. She was executed. Her name was erased from the monuments, her face from the coins. Only the memory of her defiance remained, a quiet warning that even sisters could fall to the crown's sharpest edge. Cleopatra also had a younger sister, Arsinoe IV, whose story would intertwine with hers in more haunting ways. Arsinoe, clever and restless, watched from the sidelines as Cleopatra rose in prominence. At first, she remained quiet, a shadow trailing the queen. But ambition, once planted in royal soil, grows with venom. Years later, in the middle of Cleopatra's great battle for power against her brother, Arsinoe would step forward, not as an ally, but as a rival claimant to the throne. She would stir up rebellion, align herself with armies, and declare herself queen in opposition. The bond of sisterhood, so often romanticized, was here another battlefield. In the palace of the Ptolemy, even shared blood offered no safety. Cleopatra learned that love, when it existed at all, came second to legacy, and every sister's smile carried the weight of a question: friend or future enemy? Brothers and rivals. The Ptolemies blurred the lines between kinship and kingship. Cleopatra's brothers were not only her blood, they were her co-rulers, and in name even her husbands. These titles were not born of affection, but necessity. Egyptian custom demanded a male figurehead, even if the true power lay elsewhere. So Cleopatra, still a teenager, was married to her younger brother Ptolemy XIII after the death of their father. It was a political fiction, but a dangerous one. Ptolemy XIII may have been just a boy, but the court behind him was not. His advisors, particularly the powerful eunuch Pothinus, quickly saw Cleopatra's intelligence as a threat. They feared her command of language. She spoke Egyptian fluently, unlike her predecessors. They feared her charisma, her strategic mind, and her growing favour with the people. And so she was pushed aside. Banished from Alexandria, Cleopatra fled into the deserts of Syria, her crown slipping from her brow, her name nearly extinguished. But she did not fade. Instead, she gathered an army. She watched the winds of politics. She waited. And when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in pursuit of his Roman enemy, Cleopatra took her chance. With legendary cunning, she smuggled herself into Caesar's presence, wrapped, the stories say, in a rug. What followed was not just romance, but restoration. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria and crushed the opposition. Ptolemy XIII, still so young, died in battle or drowned. Accounts vary, but the end was the same. He was gone. But peace never truly returned. Another brother, Ptolemy XIV, took his place as Cleopatra's co-ruler and ceremonial husband. And though there is no record of open conflict between them, he too died young, likely poisoned. Cleopatra's path was always cleared with care, but behind the elegance of her rule, the silent pruning of rivals continued. Whether by design or by necessity, her brothers disappeared, one by one. And in the end, only she remained. A throne always in jeopardy. Cleopatra's early years were not shaped by comfort or tradition. They were moulded by crisis. From her earliest memories, the palace was never a sanctuary. It was a chessboard. Trust was fleeting, loyalty conditional. Advisors lied. Family turned. Soldiers changed sides. In this world, Cleopatra did not simply survive, she studied. Every glance, every pause in conversation, every absence at court taught her something. She learned that words were as sharp as spears and silence more dangerous than shouting. She became fluent in many tongues, able to speak with Greeks, Romans, Jews, Arab, and her own Egyptian people. She read deeply, studied medicine, politics, and philosophy, but above all, she observed people. While others relied on force or flattery, Cleopatra used understanding. She saw the hidden wants in others and used those wants to build her steps to power. As a child, she walked past statues of gods and queens, but the stories she heard were not of peace and unity. They were of how quickly glory fades. Her father's voice carried tremors of fear when Roman names were spoken. Her sister's absence taught her how swift justice could be. Her brother's hostility reminded her that smiles were often masks. And so she grew not just into a woman, but into a ruler whose very breath was measured, whose every step was laced with caution. For Cleopatra, the throne was not a destination. It was a battlefield. She sat not in comfort, but in readiness. And though the world would later remember her for her beauty, her romance, and her fall, what defined her from the beginning was this: a sharp mind raised in shadows, a queen shaped by the lessons of a bloodline that consumed itself. In this lineage of betrayal, Cleopatra did the one thing few others managed. She endured. Chapter 3: Rise of the Strategist. In the heart of Alexandria, where scrolls whispered through the corridors of the great library and marble halls shimmered in the Mediterranean sun, Cleopatra grew not just in stature, but in mind. The world around her was ancient and vast, full of knowledge stacked high in papyrus and etched in stone. She was not yet queen, not yet legend, but already something rare, a girl with a mind as luminous as the stars she studied. Her tutors were the finest minds of the time, hand-picked philosophers, astronomers, and mathematicians from across the Hellenistic world. They didn't simply lecture her, they challenged her. They knew she would not be content with surface knowledge. She wanted to understand the mechanics of the heavens, the rhythms of the Nile, the hearts of people. She studied Homer in Greek, law in Egyptian, and debated Plato in flawless Latin. She learned the languages of those who might one day sit across from her in negotiation, or face her in war. By adulthood, she could speak as many as 9 tongues, each one a tool, each one a doorway into power. But she didn't chase knowledge for show. Cleopatra was drawn to learning because it gave her clarity, vision, and precision. In the silence of study, she saw the shape of things before they happened. She understood that empires didn't just fall by the sword, they fell when leaders failed to understand the winds before the storm. And so, she read, she listened, she remembered. In a city that buzzed with ideas and echoing footsteps, where carts of scrolls were wheeled through marble corridors and scholars debated under colonnades, Cleopatra walked quietly but watched everything. The daughter of a king, yes, but also a student of eternity. She was not in a hurry. She knew power would come, but wisdom would come first. The theatre of rhetoric. It was not enough for Cleopatra to know. She had to be heard. And in the world of kings and generals, being heard was a dangerous art. So she studied the way words moved people. She attended debates in the amphitheatres, not as a guest, but as a silent shadow. She watched how men wielded language like a dagger, how pauses could unnerve, how a single gesture could silence a room. Soon, it was her turn. In private gatherings and family assemblies, she began to speak. Slowly at first, gently, as if testing the weight of her own voice. But what emerged was something magnetic. She did not shout, she did not overreach. Instead, Cleopatra spoke with a calm that made others lean in. She mastered silence as much as speech. Her presence filled rooms, not through volume, but through precision. She understood that oratory was not performance. It was warfare without weapons. When she spoke, she painted pictures, not arguments. She made people feel before she made them think. Even those who disagreed with her found themselves caught in the rhythm of her words, swayed not by logic alone, but by something deeper. She had studied not just rhetoric, but psychology, though they did not call it that then. And when she did not speak, she still spoke. A glance, a raised brow, a well-timed breath. all of it part of her growing power. It wasn't just knowledge that set Cleopatra apart. It was her ability to wrap it in beauty, precision, and emotional depth. Words became her arrows, silence her shield. She was learning not just to speak to crowds, but to command them, learning to rule in secret. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was a ruler often swayed by foreign powers and the complexities of court intrigue. As he stumbled through alliances with Rome and navigated threats from within Egypt's own noble families, Cleopatra watched. She learned from the edges, from the corridors of the palace rather than its throne. She learned how power moved, not through proclamations but through whispers, debts, favours and fears. She was never far from the chambers where treaties were signed or broken, never far from the quiet quarrels behind silk curtains. She learned how coins could do what armies could not, how gifts to the right priest could change the fate of a temple, how fear could be planted gently like a seed and grown in silence. This was the Egypt of late dynasties, more about diplomacy than conquest, more about survival than glory. And she saw the risks. She saw what happened to those who trusted too easily, those who spoke before listening. Her older siblings, jealous and entitled, mocked her intellect but missed her subtlety. She let them underestimate her. She preferred it that way. In the court, where masks were more common than faces, Cleopatra wore hers carefully. She smiled, she nodded, she obeyed. But she never stopped calculating. At night, when others slept, she reviewed what she had heard. Who was loyal? Who was not? Which generals moved with purpose and which ones moved only when gold jingled? She began to understand that ruling was not about being seen. It was about seeing. And though she did not yet wear the crown, she was already preparing to carry its weight. A mind sharper than any blade. As Cleopatra reached her late teens, she was no longer simply a daughter of the dynasty. She was becoming its strategist. Though her father still sat on the throne, his influence weakened with each passing year. Cleopatra, sensing the cracks in the foundation, began to make her quiet moves. She forged relationships not through declarations but through shared interests. She spent time with military advisors, not discussing war, but asking about terrain, trade routes and loyalty. She met with priests not to flatter, but to understand their grievances. She gave gifts, asked questions, and listened far more than she'd pay. In doing so, she built trust, not in grand gestures, but in hundreds of quiet, invisible threads. Even the Roman envoys, so often dismissive of the Eastern courts, noticed her. They found in Cleopatra a young woman who not only spoke Latin fluently, but understood Roman pride, Roman fear, Roman appetite. She didn't flatter them, she mirrored them. She made them feel seen, and in doing so they remembered her. By the time her father died, and civil war brewed between her and her brother for control of Egypt, Cleopatra was already several steps ahead. The alliances had been set, the groundwork laid. The child once tucked in study halls now emerged with eyes sharpened by the years of watching, waiting, and planning. She had not rushed her rise, she had crafted it. In a world where men jostled for dominance and warships lined harbours, Cleopatra's weapon was her mind. No blade could match its precision, no army could match its patience. And as the sun rose over Alexandria, painting the city in gold, a strategist stepped forward, not with noise but with vision. She would not wait to be given power, she would take it, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 4: Queen in the Sandstorm. Two young rulers stood on the marble steps of power, both crowned but not equal. Cleopatra, just 17, was named queen alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, in a carefully scripted ceremony echoing ancient rituals. The golden crowns shimmered beneath the Egyptian sun, yet behind the ceremonial beauty, a fracture had already formed. Though the Ptolemies had long ruled Egypt in tandem, siblings as sovereigns, the balance was often fragile. This time it cracked almost immediately. Cleopatra, bold and politically sharp, refused to be a puppet. She stepped forward in court meetings, made decisions without waiting, and signed documents in her name alone. It was subtle at first, but it broke the unspoken rule. In this palace, power was to be shared, more precisely, veiled behind the boy king and his advisors. The royal court in Alexandria had always been a place of whispers, but now it buzzed louder. Some saw Cleopatra as overreaching, Others saw her as the ruler Egypt needed. The city itself mirrored the tension. Merchants watched the Nile nervously, nobles clung to their alliances, and the people, tired from grain shortages and rising taxes, grew restless. A double crown was supposed to symbolize unity, but this time it became a sign of division. Cleopatra's presence at public festivals and in administrative offices signaled that she was not merely co-ruler. She was queen, and in a kingdom where appearances meant survival, this was dangerous. Soon, rumours began to circle that a move was coming, a quiet removal, a shift in palace winds. She may have worn the crown, but the throne beneath her was already beginning to shift. The boy king and his puppeteers. While Cleopatra faced the people, her brother Ptolemy XIII remained behind palace doors. Only 12 years old, he was too young to rule in any true sense. But those who stood beside him, the triumvirate of Pothinos, Theodotus, and Achilles, understood the game well. These three men had no royal blood, but they carried sharp minds and sharper intentions. They were not advisors, they were architects of control. Pothinos, the chamberlain, was a master of manipulation. He whispered the right fears into Ptolemy's ears and manoeuvred behind every decision. Theodotus, a tutor with a silver tongue, offered words of flattery and law, cloaking ambition in philosophy. Achilles, the general of the army, held the power of the sword. Together, they surrounded the young king like shadows at high noon, always present, always watching. As Cleopatra asserted herself, the triumvirate began laying the foundation for her removal. They started by erasing her name from official documents. Her face vanished from coins, her name from edicts. They questioned her loyalty, accused her of plotting alone. One day, her guards were reassigned. The next, her chambers were moved to a smaller wing. It was a silent siege, not of war, but of bureaucracy and fear. The message was clear: she was being pushed out. Behind these actions was more than jealousy. It was survival. Cleopatra's intelligence and independence threatened the careful balance Pothinos and his companions had built. If she remained, she would expose their control, so they acted swiftly, removing her name from papyrus scrolls and her presence from the palace. There was no formal announcement. There didn't need to be. One morning, she simply wasn't queen anymore. Exile in the eastern wind. Cleopatra fled not as a fallen ruler, but as a woman shaped by storms. She did not vanish into obscurity. She moved eastward, towards Syria, carried by winds of ancient trade and political intrigue. The desert was vast, but she knew its roads. Along the fringes of the Levant, she began to plant the seeds of return. In Syria, she found space to breathe. The air was dry, but the minds around her were sharp. She was not alone. Loyal friends, mercenaries, and scribes followed her. Letters were sent, messengers dispatched, alliances tested. This was not a queen in mourning, this was a queen re-strategizing. Her exile was not a retreat, it was a recalibration. By the banks of the Orontes River, she learned more than governance. She studied how armies were raised, how diplomacy unfolded across borders. She listened to the merchants who knew how to move gold and grain, and to soldiers who could sense the tide of war before it arrived. The desert, with all its silence, spoke to her more honestly than the marble walls of Alexandria ever had. Word reached her of how the triumvirate tightened their grip back home, of how her name had become a whisper among servants. Still, she waited. Timing would be everything. A misstep could mean death, but a well-timed return could mean history. And so, under starlit tents and over dusty maps, Cleopatra did not grieve her loss. She planned her resurrection. The sand-forged resolve. The queen who once walked palace halls in silk now rode horses through sandstorms. Her voice, once used for soft diplomacy, now issued orders to soldiers. Cleopatra was no longer merely royal. She was forged by exile, tempered by betrayal, and sharpened by purpose. Each morning brought drills, discussions, and dreams of Egypt. She began to build her own army, not vast but loyal. Syrians, Arabs, Greek mercenaries. They came for gold, for allegiance, for hope. Some followed because of how they believed in her, others because they feared what Ptolemy's rule had become. Around her, a small court took shape again. Advisors who listened, warriors who respected, and scribes who recorded not just what she said but how she carried herself. Cleopatra's leadership grew clearer. She did not bark commands, she earned trust. She spoke with conviction, even when uncertainty loomed. She knew her own faults, and rather than hide them, she learned to lead through them. In the deserts east of Egypt, she became something stronger than a queen. She became a force. Then came the moment that changed everything. News arrived that Julius Caesar, the Roman general whose name now echoed across empires, had landed in Alexandria. The Roman civil war had spilled into Egypt. Caesar sought to settle a debt to claim what Rome was owed, but for Cleopatra this was more than foreign diplomacy, it was a doorway. Rome would not fight a civil war over a divided Egypt, it would crown the one who could promise stability and loyalty. Cleopatra knew that she must return, not quietly, not in secret, but in brilliance. The girl who had once stood beside a boy king was now ready to stand alone. With her small army at her side, she began the journey back to Egypt. Across the sands, through the narrow passes, and into the heart of her homeland, not with a crown on her head, but with fire in her eyes. The storm that cast her out had not broken her. It had built her. And in Alexandria, a new chapter waited, one that would place her face to face with Rome and with destiny. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Carpet. Alexandria trembled beneath a sky choked with dust and tension. The marble city, once proud and glistening with the dreams of Alexander, now echoed with footsteps of unrest. Factions clashed in the streets, shadows moved with knives, and the Nile no longer ran quiet. Into this storm stepped a man not used to being denied. Julius Caesar had come to Egypt not just as a Roman general, but as a force of change, a man who bent history by the weight of his will. The sails of his ships had barely dried when his presence rippled through the city like thunder. Caesar entered Alexandria not with ceremony, but with control. Pompey, his great rival, had just been murdered on Egyptian shores, betrayed by the young King Ptolemy XIII in an attempt to win Caesar's favour. But instead of reward, the king earned only Caesar's cold contempt. The Roman general took residence in the royal palace, not as a guest, but as a man laying claim to order amidst chaos. The boy king's advisors murmured uneasily. The balance of power had shifted. Alexandria watched. The world waited. Though Caesar had come chasing the remnants of Rome's civil war, he now stood at the heart of another kingdom's feud. Cleopatra, the deposed queen, was nowhere to be seen. Whispers of her exile echoed through the marble halls. Some said she was in hiding, others that she had fled beyond the Nile. Yet the air felt heavy, as if destiny held its breath. For Caesar was not just a warrior. He was a seeker of greatness. And greatness often arrives wrapped in unexpected forms. Outside the palace gates, loyalties twisted in silence. Rome stood like a blade between brother and sister, king and queen. And in the deep corridors of the palace, as torches flickered against walls of ancient stone, a plan was being woven, softly, daringly, in the hands of a woman who would not be forgotten. The daring entrance. Night draped Alexandria in velvet shadows. The palace guards stood stiff at their posts, their eyes half-lidded with routine. Inside, Caesar paced with the restlessness of a man accustomed to movement. The city was not yet his. Its rulers were children playing with fire, and somewhere in the margins of power, a queen waited. Then came a knock, not thunderous, but soft, deliberate. A servant entered, dragging what looked like a rolled tapestry, tightly bound in coarse linen, worn from travel. Nothing about it seemed regal. Nothing seemed extraordinary. But as Caesar watched, curious yet wary, the linen unfurled. And from its folds, like the unveiling of a legend, Cleopatra emerged. She did not stumble, she did not gasp for breath. She rose with the poise of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. Her eyes met his without flinching. She was young, yes, but her gaze held centuries of royalty. She was not adorned like a queen, not yet, but the air shifted around her as though the room recognized her blood. Cleopatra's entrance was more than bold. It was theatrical, calculated, unforgettable. She had risked everything to stand before him, not just safety or dignity, but the rules of her world. Egyptian tradition did not permit such gestures. Queens did not sneak into the presence of foreign rulers, but Cleopatra was not bound by tradition. She knew that power, real power, comes not from thrones but from moments, And this moment was hers. Caesar looked at her not with laughter, nor scorn, but with recognition. Here was someone who understood risk, someone who met ambition with equal fire. The room was still, yet charged with unspoken currents. They spoke in measured tones, but the silence between words said more. She made no plea for help. Instead, she offered alliance, strategy, survival, wrapped in silk, scented with myrrh and armed with the gravity of a queen unbowed. By the time dawn broke across the Mediterranean, Cleopatra was no longer in exile. She was once again part of the palace, and Caesar, a man surrounded by enemies, had found a companion who would fight not from behind him, but beside him. The bond that shook empires. In the quiet days that followed, Caesar and Cleopatra's bond deepened, not in haste but in understanding. It was not love at first glance. It was something slower, deeper, a meeting of minds as much as hearts. Cleopatra did not try to impress him with beauty alone, though she had that in abundance. She impressed him with knowledge, with confidence, with a vision that stretched beyond her years. She spoke 9 languages. She knew the weight of empire, the fragility of power. And Caesar, who had spent a lifetime studying men and maneuvering empires, saw in her something rare, a woman who did not yield, even in the face of ruin. Their days were filled with quiet conversations, often under the shade of garden colonnades. They talked of Rome and Egypt, of stars and scrolls, of war and poetry. They did not always agree, but they always listened. Cleopatra offered Caesar more than admiration. She offered him legacy, and Caesar offered her something even rarer in her world: respect. The court watched in silence. Some disapproved, some whispered of scandal, but others saw the future reshaping itself before their eyes. Rome's general and Egypt's queen were becoming something more than rulers. They were becoming partners, 2 worlds intertwining like the threads of fate. But theirs was not a bond of softness alone. It was forged in fire. Both had enemies. Both had lost. And both knew that love, in such a world, was also a form of war. Their alliance shook the marble halls of the palace and the granite hearts of senators across the sea. For this was not just desire. This was strategy wrapped in affection, power softened by intimacy. It was a bond strong enough to withstand not only judgment but siege. And that siege would come, sooner than they expected, harder than they feared. The siege of the Queen's city. The streets of Alexandria, once filled with music and trade, now echoed with the sound of swords and shouted orders. War had come. Ptolemy XIII, resentful of Cleopatra's sudden return and threatened by Caesar's power, refused to bow. His forces surrounded the palace, cutting off the Roman general and the queen he now protected. Inside, the palace became a fortress. Marble halls were transformed into battlegrounds. Statues shattered under the weight of catapults. Flames licked the edges of royal scrolls. Soldiers bled on mosaic floors. But Cleopatra did not flee. She stood with Caesar side by side, not hidden in chambered rooms but among the wounded and the watchful. It was a siege of smoke and desperation. Supplies dwindled. Communications were severed. The sea turned against them, blocking Roman reinforcements. And still, they held. One night, the great library of Alexandria, the heart of ancient knowledge, caught fire in the chaos. Scrolls that had survived centuries turned to ash in hours. It was not intentional, but it was tragic. And though Caesar had not ordered it, the flames stained his name forever. In some corners of history, Cleopatra wept for the loss. But then she steadied, for the city still needed saving, and history, though it burned, also waited to be rewritten. Then came a shift in the wind. Reinforcements from Rome finally arrived, led by General Mithridates of Pergamum. They cut through the enemy lines like thunder, breaking silence. The siege faltered. The boy king's forces scattered. In a final desperate attempt to escape, Ptolemy XIII Themisos tried to cross the Nile. But the waters did not favour him. His body was found days later, drowned beneath the river's quiet cruelty. The city grew still once more. Within the palace, the echoes of war slowly faded, and as the dust settled over burned scrolls and broken stone, Cleopatra stood unbroken, a queen restored, not by chance but by choice, by daring. And by the most unexpected partnership in the empire's long story. Julius Caesar would not stay forever, but his time in Alexandria would mark a turning point, not just for Rome and Egypt, but for the two lives that dared to shape them. Chapter 6. The Golden Reclamation. The Nile, broad and slow, had always been Egypt's quiet witness. But now its calm waters were stained by the fall of a boy king. Ptolemy XIII, once raised high by advisors and generals as the ruler of Egypt, now met his end in silence and surrender. Fleeing from Alexandria after the siege was lost, he attempted to escape by river. The young ruler, no more than a shadow of command, was swallowed by the very waters his ancestors once worshipped. His boat overturned, perhaps in panic, perhaps by fate, and the boy who tried to wear the crown alone drowned beneath the weight of decisions made in fear. There was no ceremony, no procession, no final offering to the gods. His body was found days later, waterlogged and limp, near the reeds of the Nile Delta. The messengers who brought news of his death said nothing poetic, no final speeches, no whispers of divine punishment, only the fact: the king had fallen, and Egypt had chosen its current. The city did not mourn loudly. There were no tears in the streets of Alexandria. Instead, there was a hush, a waiting stillness, as if the nation paused to see what might come next. For even in the griefless passing of a ruler, the people sensed a tide was shifting. One sibling was gone, the other remained. And now she stood taller. The Nile had claimed the last piece of resistance. What could not be won in letters or by court decree had been answered by water. Cleopatra, the sister once pushed to the margins, had survived the storm, and in the silence after Ptolemy's fall, Egypt breathed again, its heartbeat faint but returning. The coronation of power. There was no need for another civil war. No blood was left to spill. With Caesar beside her, and the rival drowned, Cleopatra stepped forward not with violence, but with ceremony. A coronation was prepared, rich in gold, soaked in incense, woven through with the old rites that had once crowned queens and pharaohs since the earliest sands. But this time the ritual held a deeper note: rebirth. At the centre of Alexandria, within the temple grounds, she was declared sovereign not as co-ruler with her brother, but as sole monarch. To fulfill legal custom, she named another brother, Ptolemy XIV, a child, as her junior co-ruler, but no one doubted who held the real power. The crowd gathered not to see another Ptolemy rise, but to witness Cleopatra reign. She wore robes of the old gods, golden threads that shimmered like sunlit reeds. Upon her brow was the vulture crown of Isis, radiant and stern, and beside her, in the arms of nurses and priests, was a new child, her son, Caesarion, born of Julius Caesar, a prince whose bloodline braided the rivers of Egypt with the marble veins of Rome. His presence was more than symbolic. Cleopatra was making a promise that Egypt would not merely endure, it would be born again, through her and through him. The priests chanted, the people bowed. The gods, silent though they were, seemed to return their gaze to the throne. And as Cleopatra stood before her people, she did not flinch. Her voice was steady, her steps slow, her breath measured. She had been tempered by exile, by war, by loss. Now she ruled with clarity. That day the sun lingered just a little longer over Alexandria. A city long frayed by division watched as its queen began to sew the torn seams of its soul. A kingdom awakened. Cleopatra had reclaimed more than a throne. She had inherited a kingdom worn thin by misrule, but she had always known Egypt's true wealth, its grain, its temples, its learning, and its unmatched location between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now she breathed life back into it all. The Nile's flow was once again measured and controlled. Irrigation channels were restored, and harvests began to fill granaries that had been empty during the years of civil war. Farmers were granted leniency in taxes, and in return the fields of the delta turned golden again. Egypt became the breadbasket of the Eastern world, and ships once idle in harbour began setting sail once more, loaded with grain, papyrus and perfume. In the cities, Cleopatra paid homage to the gods, not as duty, but as devotion. She walked barefoot through the temple of Isis, offering incense with her own hands. She restored sacred festivals long abandoned and had herself painted as both pharaoh and goddess, merging her image with tradition, blending mortal queen and divine mother. Alexandria became not just a port but a symbol. She invited scholars from across the Mediterranean to return to its library. She funded translations, repairs, and the education of Egypt's elite. Her court shimmered with culture, science, and subtle diplomacy. And in every direction, east towards Syria, west toward Carthage's ruins, north toward Greece, Egypt's name was once again spoken with a kind of reverence, not for its size, not for its army, but for its queen. She ruled not with cruelty but with intelligence, and she ruled not as a Roman pawn but as an Egyptian mind. She understood the weight of gold, the whisper of silk, the symbols carved into temple walls, and the quiet power of waiting. Her rule was a quiet miracle. No grand empires fell, no continents were conquered. But Egypt woke from its long sleep, not with a trumpet, but with a breath. Whispers from across the sea, but across the sea, in Rome, her name echoed with a different tone. Cleopatra, the queen of incense and learning, of gods and grain, had become a symbol. For some, she was a muse, an enigma, a living link between myth and empire. For others, she was a threat. Roman senators did not know whether to admire her or fear her. Her presence in Caesar's life stirred unease. He had not brought her as a chained prisoner, as some would have liked, but as an honoured guest. She had walked among Rome's streets, housed in luxury, with Caesarion by her side. Some whispered she wished him to be named heir. A boy born of a Roman and a queen, what empire would not shift at such a bloodline? Poets and pamphlets took hold of her story, turning her into something both exotic and dangerous. They wrote of her as a sorceress, weaving spells over Caesar with her voice, her scent, her eyes. Others, with more careful ink, described her as a philosopher queen, a ruler of rare grace, but none were neutral. She stirred imaginations and suspicions alike. The Senate watched Caesar's actions more closely. Every meeting with Cleopatra became a topic of concern. Every public event in which she was seen by his side added fuel to silent fires. For many Romans, empire was not to be shared, and a queen from Egypt, no matter how learned, no matter how beautiful, was a stranger to the laws of the Republic. Still, she lingered in memory. Even after returning to Alexandria, her shadow remained in Roman minds, not as a fading echo, but as a pulse. She had not conquered Rome with swords. She had done something quieter. She had made Rome question its own power. And so, across the sea, as she ruled her river kingdom with silent strength, 1,000 eyes kept watching, some with admiration, others with dread, but all with fascination. Chapter 7. The Queen in Rome. The wind was soft over the Tiber that day, warm and sweet, carrying the scent of spring and the hush of a watching city. Rome, proud, stone-skinned Rome, stood waiting. Crowds had gathered along the shaded roads and marble arcades, their eyes turned toward the grand arrival. And then, like a vision from a dream carved in gold, Cleopatra came. Draped in silks finer than any Roman weave, with gold coiled around her wrists and neck like tamed serpents, she stood beneath a canopy of lotus and linen. Her barge, no longer the mythic vessel of Nile waters, but now a moving temple of light, drifted through the port with velvet sails and oars dipped in rhythm to invisible music. At her side was her son, Caesarion, child of two worlds, held proudly as a living claim to power. The people gasped, whispered, stared. She was not a queen of their mould, not the quiet wife of duty, nor the passive shadow of politics. She was radiant, unapologetic, and utterly foreign, and that made her dangerous. The senators stiffened. The matrons whispered behind fans. But the people were enchanted. Rome had seen its share of rulers, tyrants, and gods, but Cleopatra was something else. She seemed carved from starlight and ambition. Her presence didn't beg for approval, it assumed it. She came not as a guest, but as someone whose story had already been etched into the city's destiny. And in the quiet spaces between footsteps and chariot wheels, one could almost hear the heart of Rome skipping, a beat of awe, a beat of fear. Cleopatra had entered their world and nothing would remain untouched. Caesar's mistress, Rome's mirror. Julius Caesar had never bowed to tradition, and his open relationship with Cleopatra was proof of that. It was not whispered, it was displayed. Her home in Rome was regal and grand, offered by Caesar himself. just beyond the river. There, in the shadow of the Republic's crumbling customs, he kept a foreign queen beneath his protection. To some it was a scandal, to others it was treason. Yet Caesar seemed unmoved. He walked beside her through his gardens. He let her name echo in his halls, and when asked about the child Caesarion, he said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. To the elite, Cleopatra was a threat not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. She was everything Rome both desired and despised. Beauty, intellect, authority wrapped in mystery. She dared to rule, not as a consort but as a sovereign. Her charm was deliberate, her gaze unblinking. The Roman women, trained in modesty and silence, looked upon her and saw a kind of unspoken rebellion. The Roman men saw a mirror held to their own ambitions, a woman who played the game of empire as well as any of them, and perhaps better. For Caesar, she was more than lover or trophy. She was proof of his power, the living symbol of his reach beyond the Tiber. But that very reach frightened others. Senators saw their influence slipping as Caesar grew closer to the east to her. Rome's foundations were shaking, not from war but from love, or what looked like love, what felt like destiny. Cleopatra didn't conquer with soldiers in Rome, she conquered with presence, and each time she stood beside Caesar it felt less like romance and more like prophecy unfolding. The monument of Venus. In a city ruled by symbols, Caesar offered the boldest yet. He commissioned a statue of Cleopatra to stand within the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess of love, and his own claimed ancestor. It was no modest gesture, it was a thunderclap. Cleopatra, immortalized in stone, standing as a deity beside the divine mother of the Julian line. For Rome it was unthinkable. A queen, a foreigner, not only honoured but deified. It wasn't just scandal, it was sacrilege. The sculptors worked carefully, chiselling her likeness into smooth marble, eyes wide and lips soft, head held in regal stillness. The robe fell across the statue like flowing silk, her crown rising like the sun itself. Visitors came to gape, some stood in awe, others seethed in silence. Rumours swirled like smoke. Was Caesar naming her a goddess? Was he placing her above Roman women, Roman gods, Roman law? The Senate fumed, even allies found themselves uneasy. To Cleopatra, the statue was more than flattery. It was strategy. It secured her presence not just in Rome's streets, but in its sacred spaces. She became a part of its mythology, part of its future. And if Venus was the mother of Caesar's line, then Cleopatra, by proximity and love, was its chosen queen. The lines between devotion and ambition blurred. Her image in the temple was a message carved in stone. Cleopatra was no longer just a visitor. She had been placed at the heart of Roman identity. But stone has weight, and with every admirer who bowed before her likeness, there was a senator sharpening his resentment. Statues are made to last, but so are grudges, and from the moment that sculpture was raised, a new shadow grew behind Caesar's back. Whispers became voices, loyalty became doubt, and the threads of fate began to tighten around both him and her. Storm before the knife. The tension in Rome was no longer subtle. It shimmered in the air like heat before a thunderstorm. Caesar, triumphant in war and adored by many, had begun to taste the fruits of absolute power. He wore it like a crown, invisible but heavy. His reforms were sweeping, his rule unchecked. He had been named dictator for life. To his enemies, it was the final straw. Rome had fought kings for centuries, only to now watch one rise again, draped not in native robes, but cloaked in Eastern perfume. Cleopatra watched this unfold from the quiet edge of Caesar's world. She saw the tides shift, even if he refused to. She knew how quickly love could turn to envy, how power gathered not only allies but blades in the dark. Her presence in Rome, once dazzling, now felt fragile like silk stretched over fire. She was mother to Caesar's child. She was queen to his desire, but she was also foreign, and too many feared what that meant for Rome's future. Whispers of monarchy circled like vultures, accusations that Cleopatra would become queen of Rome, that Caesarion would rule after Caesar. Whether true or not, the fear was real. The Ides of March loomed. The sky did not darken, but the silence before the storm deepened. Men met in secret. Swords were hidden beneath cloaks. Plans were sealed in looks exchanged across marble chambers, and Cleopatra, ever the strategist, knew she could not stop what was coming. Caesar walked boldly into fate, blind to the danger he had inspired, and when the knife would fall, it would not only pierce his chest, it would sever the fragile future they had begun to imagine together. That morning, as he dressed in white and stepped out into the Roman air, Cleopatra remained behind. Whether she sensed what was to come, we do not know. But when the news reached her that Caesar had fallen, surrounded by men who once called him friend, her world shattered in silence, not just for love loss, but for power, position, and the dream of a child who now stood in the shadows of two worlds. Chapter 8. The Day the World Split. The wind that swept through Rome in March of 44 BCE carried something different. It was a hush that settled on the marble steps of the Senate, a stillness in the heart of an empire used to noise. That day, the world held its breath. Julius Caesar, the man who had bent time itself with his ambitions, entered the theatre of Pompey with the weight of gods behind him. But even gods fall. It was a morning like any other, and yet nothing would ever be the same. Inside the Senate, shadows gathered behind smiles. The men Caesar believed to be allies had sharpened more than just their minds. Blades hid beneath robes. Words turned to whispers. The conspiracy, once scattered fragments, now moved as one, like a tide set to drown its moon. As Caesar approached his seat, the circle closed. There were no speeches, only the first sting of steel. One cut became many. Names, once bound by loyalty, now echoed like curses. Brutus, Cassius, et tu. Caesar fell not in battle, but under the painted ceiling of power, surrounded not by enemies, but by those who had once sworn to stand by him. The Senate floor, meant for law, ran red. Rome, in one cruel moment, was without its master. News did not travel slowly. It ran like wildfire through every street and corner. And across the sea, far from the cobbled stones of Rome, it reached Cleopatra. She was still in the Eternal City, the Queen of Egypt among foreign pillars and foreign tongues. But in Caesar's Rome, she had been more than a guest. She had been a symbol, a lover, the mother of his son. And now she was something else entirely, a danger. In the hours after the assassination, the city trembled. Cleopatra could not remain. The hands that had embraced her just days ago now reached for daggers. Fear became her shadow. There was no time for mourning, only flight. With Caesarion in her arms and the echoes of Caesar's fall still ringing in her ears, Cleopatra slipped from Rome's grasp. The harbour watched her leave, sails catching wind like wings in retreat. The queen who had tasted Rome's heart now sailed back to a world broken open. A widow without a nation. The voyage across the Mediterranean was quiet, but not peaceful. The sea was wide, but it could not hold her sorrow. The waves whispered of what was lost. Power, safety, and the man who had once steadied her throne with his name. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria not as a victorious consort, but as a widow to a vision that no longer existed. Caesar's death had taken more than his life. It had torn the foundation from beneath her future. The people of Egypt welcomed her with loyalty, but they sensed the shift. Cleopatra no longer held Rome's favour. The throne beneath her feet felt colder. Alone, with a child too young to understand the world's betrayal, she stood on the edge of uncertainty. Caesarion, her son by the fallen dictator, was a living symbol of Rome, of danger, and of potential. But symbols invite fear, and fear breeds enemies. Her dreams of Caesarion someday ruling both Egypt and Rome dimmed like fading lanterns in the dark. No one in Rome would honour his blood now. Cleopatra, once so certain, now faced a world that no longer made promises. She rebuilt quietly with care. The palace became both sanctuary and prison. She could trust no one beyond the walls. Politics twisted like desert winds, and every alliance had a price. Her sister Arsinoe, once a rival, had been executed on Caesar's orders. Her brother husbands were gone. Now Cleopatra ruled alone, with Caesarion as her only legacy. Her court shimmered with beauty, but underneath it all pulsed tension. She was the queen of a kingdom hemmed in by a dying alliance with Rome split and bleeding. Her power, once amplified by Caesar's hand, was now her burden to carry alone. Yet Cleopatra did not break. Even in grief she planned. She listened to whispers from the west. Rome was not done bleeding, and from its wounds 2 names rose, Mark Antony and Octavian. The next chapter of her life would depend on which way the wind of war would blow, a new world in flames. In the wake of Caesar's death, Rome did not heal. It fractured. His murder had opened a void, and into that space rushed 2 storms. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, bold and burning with pride, and Octavian, Caesar's heir in name, quiet but cunning, still just a youth but already wielding the weight of legacy. Rome split down its centre. The streets turned into battlegrounds of ideas and loyalties. Speeches were no longer enough. Armies were needed. Blood answered blood. The assassins of Caesar fled but were hunted down one by one. The republic they claimed to save slipped through their fingers like sand. In its place rose something new and uncertain, a struggle not for justice but for control. Mark Antony took command of Caesar's veterans. He wore grief like armour and ambition like fire. He knew power, but not how to share it. Octavian, with his boyish charm and sharp mind, played the long game. Together, for a moment, they formed the Second Triumvirate, 3 men dividing the empire like scavengers. But such alliances are made of glass. Egypt watched from the edge. Cleopatra read the signs in every Roman report, in every trader's tale. She had met Mark Antony before, briefly. She remembered his laughter, his roughness, his appetite for life. He was nothing like Caesar, but he had something the world respected: strength. And more importantly, he had a reason to come east. The eastern provinces needed taming, and Cleopatra had what he wanted: ships, money, grain, and the last echo of Caesar's world. So the queen waited, and the fire in Rome kept burning. Antony's armies marched. Octavian manoeuvred. The republic crumbled into dust, and in the ashes, Cleopatra prepared to rise, not as the widow of a dream, but as the architect of a new one. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the heat of the wind. The waiting queen. Alexandria breathed differently in those years. The city moved slowly, like a heartbeat waiting to quicken. Cleopatra ruled with grace, but behind her eyes was a storm of thought. Her court dazzled. Perfumed halls, soft music, scrolls of science and starlight. But the queen was not distracted. She was listening, learning, watching. In the silence of grief, she transformed. She shed the role of Caesar's consort and stood alone in her own shadow. Cleopatra studied Antony's campaigns, his failures, his victories. She followed Octavian's rise, careful not to provoke him. She knew the game was no longer about glory. It was about survival. And she would not let Egypt fall because of Rome's chaos. At her side, Caesarion grew. The boy had his father's eyes and his mother's mind. Cleopatra kept him close but not cloistered. He was trained as a king should be, in languages, law and legacy. His future was still uncertain, but she carved space for him with every decision she made. She reformed the economy, strengthened the navy, secured trade routes. Her people saw not a mourning queen, but a monarch of purpose. And in the quiet of her palace she waited, not for rescue, but for opportunity. Mark Antony across the sea would come. She could feel it. The world was turning, and soon the tide would touch her shores again. One day the messenger arrived. Antony called for her, requesting her presence in Tarsus in Cilicia. He needed her fleet, her gold, her allegiance. But Cleopatra understood. It was not a summons. It was an invitation to reshape the world again, and so she began to prepare, not in haste but with intention. The waiting queen would no longer wait. She would arrive not as a widow, but as a goddess. Her ship would shimmer, her sails catching sunlight like silk. Alexandria would hold its breath once more as the Queen of the Nile set sail, not to beg, but to rule. The day the world split had broken many, but Cleopatra had endured, and now her story turned toward fire, love, and the edge of destiny. Chapter 9, When Gods Meet Again. The river moved slowly that day, like a ribbon of bronze under a dusk-lit sky. The water whispered around the stones and stirred reeds along its banks. It was the Cydnus River, flowing through the heart of Tarsus, and on this particular day, it seemed to pause, to hold its breath. News had spread quickly that she was coming. Not merely a queen, they said, but a vision, a goddess wrapped in the skin of a mortal. Mark Antony, the Roman general and ruler of the East, had summoned her. But Cleopatra did not arrive as a subject. She arrived as a force. Her barge came into view like a dream sailing out of myth. Its sails shimmered violet and gold, catching the last honeyed light of the sun. Oars dipped in perfect rhythm, churning the water softly, as if even the rowers dared not disturb the illusion. The boat itself was carved with silver and cedar, fragrant with incense that drifted in tendrils across the water. Cleopatra sat beneath a canopy of cloth so fine it seemed made from the breath of flowers. She was dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, the deity of love and rebirth, reclining on a couch of woven pearls. Around her danced boys dressed as cupids, and behind her rose music from unseen flutes and lyres. The air smelled of cinnamon, frankincense and rose. Locals lined the riverbanks in silence. It was not lust they felt, nor even admiration. It was reverence. Cleopatra had studied the ancient tales. She knew how stories become power. So she made herself into a story the moment she stepped aboard that barge. Every glance, every scent, every shimmer on the water, it was all deliberate. Not as a trick, but as a message. She would not come to Antony on his terms. She would come as a goddess and let the world decide who truly held the greater throne. The spectacle was more than beauty. It was strategy made silk. And as the barge pulled ashore, with flowers raining from the air and the sound of soft drums echoing against the stone walls of Tarsus, Mark Antony stepped forward, not as a conqueror, but as a man about to be conquered. The fall of a Roman heart. Mark Antony had known many women. He was a Roman of the old breed, loud, proud, and accustomed to power that bent others like wind bends grass. But what he saw before him that day along the Cydnus was not weakness wrapped in gold. It was a queen who needed no crown to rule. Cleopatra disembarked slowly, each movement a verse in a poem only she could write. And Antony, standing tall and armoured, felt the edges of his world soften. What struck him was not simply her appearance, though she was radiant with intention. It was her presence. There was something in her eyes that did not blink beneath his gaze, something ancient, serpentine, like the Nile itself. When she spoke, her voice was a current, gentle but too deep to measure. She did not flatter him nor tremble. Instead, she treated him as an equal, perhaps even less. And strangely, he found no offence in it. He found relief. Cleopatra did not try to seduce Antony. She showed him a mirror, one that reflected the greatness he still hoped to achieve. Rome had begun to fracture, and Antony felt it. He was drifting, unsure where to place his loyalties. Cleopatra, in contrast, was rooted in the soil of centuries and stories older than Rome itself. She had faced storms he had only read about, and in her calm he saw a kind of salvation. That evening, they dined together in her temporary palace, and the hours slipped away like silk through fingers. They did not speak only of beauty or desire. They spoke of empires, of trade, of how the East could breathe life back into the aging lungs of Roman ambition. As the moon rose over the river, Antony felt the lines of his heart being redrawn, not through charm but through gravity. This woman was not a passing pleasure. She was a world, and he wanted to live in it. Feasts and flames in Alexandria. When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, she did not come alone. Antony followed, not as a guest, but as a willing partner. The city welcomed him with music and torchlight, its white marble walls catching fire with golden glow. Alexandria was a city of knowledge, of temples and towers, of astronomers and dreamers. But now, it became something more. It became a stage for love. Their nights were filled with laughter and long conversations, where languages blended and wine poured like rivers. They founded a society called the Inimitable Livers, a gathering of poets, thinkers, dancers, and fools. They dressed in costume and acted out Greek myths, played games by moonlight, and strolled the gardens at dawn. It was not frivolity, though it looked like it. It was release. In a world of soldiers and politics, they created a small kingdom of joy. But their bond went deeper than revelry. Mornings brought strategy. They debated taxes, naval routes, and alliances. Antony listened to Cleopatra's advisors, some of whom had served her father. He saw how her court moved, not with fear but with loyalty. It was different from Rome, where betrayal lay in every corner. In Egypt, Cleopatra reigned by intelligence, by presence, and by myth. Antony admired it, and he began to adopt it. They were not only lovers, They were allies in the reshaping of the world. Cleopatra gave Antony more than passion. She gave him a map, a vision of East and West united. In return, Antony gave her Roman protection, legions to guard Egypt's borders, and recognition to her children. They had twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The children were named not for Egypt, but for stars and sun. It was as if they belonged to something larger than nations, and perhaps they did. In Alexandria, their love did not burn out. It matured like old wine, richer with time. There were shadows, yes. The world outside the palace walls murmured. Rome was not quiet, but within those walls, for a time love and leadership danced as one, and the city, ancient, proud, glowing by the sea, became their shared heart. A pact of empires. Their union was not just of two people, it was of two realms, two visions of power that stretched across maps and myths. Antony declared Cleopatra's son Caesarion, born of Julius Caesar, as the rightful heir to Rome. He gave Cleopatra new lands, parts of Syria, Cyprus, and the coast of Asia Minor. It was a bold, deliberate challenge to Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and rising rival. Rome was watching, and in its Senate halls voices began to grow loud with worry and rage. They saw Cleopatra not as a queen, but as a sorceress corrupting one of their own. They whispered of Eastern decadence, of Antony's betrayal of Roman virtue. But Antony did not care. His heart had chosen. His sword had followed. Together, they began to build a new dream, one not centered in Rome, but in Alexandria. A vision where the East was not a colony but a partner, where Cleopatra and Antony would rule side by side, raising a generation born of both worlds. Their festivals grew grander, their alliances stronger. They sent emissaries across the seas, spreading promises of a golden age. But golden ages often draw storm clouds. Octavian gathered his strength in Italy. He used Rome's fear of foreign queens and Eastern gods to build his case. Cleopatra became the symbol of all that was other, all that was un-Roman. And Antony, by standing with her, stood against the tide of his homeland. Yet neither backed down. Their bond was too deep, their mission too vast. They had formed a pact not just of hearts but of crowns. Cleopatra was no longer merely a queen of Egypt. Antony was no longer just a Roman general. Together they became a myth reborn, a challenge to the order of the known world. And as their empire of love and ambition spread like fire along the edges of the Mediterranean, both knew it could not last forever. But for now, it lived. And in its flame, they stood as gods, joined not by chance, but by choice. Chapter 10. The Children of the Sun and Moon. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, symbols of a new dynastic dream. The palace stood quiet beneath the Egyptian sun, its halls shimmering with golden light and soft shadows dancing along the columns. Outside, the Nile flowed slow and eternal, its waters cradling the dreams of generations, but inside something new stirred, something that would carry forward the names of two powerful lovers. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, had given birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Their names were chosen with care and purpose: Alexander Helios, the sun, and Cleopatra Selene, the moon. These names were more than beautiful titles. They were declarations, symbols of light and balance, of divine destiny. Antony stood at Cleopatra's side as they held their children for the first time. It was a quiet moment, filled with wonder, as if the very air in the room had stilled to witness it. To Cleopatra, this was more than motherhood. It was a statement to the world. The children of Egypt and Rome had been born, a new age had begun. Their little hands were still too small to grasp sceptres, yet already their presence spoke of empires. One day perhaps they would rule side by side. The sun would rise over the lands of the East, and the moon would light the path of queens. In her children, Cleopatra saw the rebirth of a legacy older than Rome itself. Through them, Egypt would not fade quietly into history, it would burn brighter. And Antony, ever the soldier, saw a different kind of conquest, one made not by the sword but by blood, by birth, by the building of kingdoms from love and lineage. Together they imagined a dynasty unlike any other. The East would not simply resist Rome, it would become its equal. The palace buzzed with quiet preparations. Tutors were chosen, priests gave blessings. and nurses whispered prayers in the language of the old gods. Even Alexandria itself seemed to breathe more deeply. The city had seen many rulers, but now it housed heirs not just to a throne, but to a dream. Cleopatra, Helios, and Selene were not yet old enough to understand the weight of their names, but the world, watching from across the seas, was already taking notice. And not everyone would celebrate. Kingdoms divided, kingdoms claimed. Antony grants lands to their children, drawing Rome's ire. It began with a grand ceremony, lavish, bold, and deeply symbolic. In the heart of Alexandria, before a crowd of nobles and citizens, Antony stood with Cleopatra and their children. Draped in gold and crimson, he raised his hand and declared the birth of new kingdoms. Lands from Armenia, Media, Phoenicia, and even distant Parthia were named and offered, each parcel carved not by conquest but by intention. To Alexander Helios, he gave the east. To Cleopatra Selene, the lands of Cyrenaica and Libya. Their younger brother, born later and named Ptolemy Philadelphus, was promised Syria and parts of Asia Minor. To many in the east, this act was thrilling. Here was a future shaped by Egyptian pride, Hellenistic elegance, and Roman command. But to Rome it was an insult, one not wrapped in subtlety, but laid bare in the sunlight of Alexandria. Antony, a Roman consul, had given away lands that were, by Roman claim, part of its own empire. Worse, he had done it not from a Roman temple but beside a foreign queen, and his children, his half-Egyptian children, were now being styled as monarchs. The Senate bristled. Whispers became growls. Octavian, watching with cold focus from Rome, saw an opportunity. What Antony believed to be legacy building, Octavian painted as betrayal. In the eyes of Rome, Antony had crowned a foreign queen and her children with power he had no right to give. To Octavian, this was not just political misstep, it was treason wrapped in gold. The donations of Alexandria, as the event became known, lit a slow-burning fire that would not easily be put out. The East celebrated. Statues were raised, coins were minted. Cleopatra sat on her throne with her children nearby, a vision of eternal rule, but the West, Rome, watched with suspicion and deepening anger. Kingdoms had been promised as gifts, but what Rome saw were stolen lands handed to strangers. What Antony saw as unity, Octavian saw as division. The lines between East and West were now more than cultural. They had become personal, the war of propaganda. Octavian wages a silent war of words, painting Cleopatra as a harlot queen. Before a single sword was drawn, Octavian chose his sharpest weapon, words. In marble forums, in the halls of senators, in letters passed through Rome's streets, a new image began to spread. It was not one of strategy or justice, it was of a woman, Cleopatra, painted not as a ruler but as a seductress. She was not called queen, but enchantress, not mother but temptress, not ally but threat. And Antony, in Octavian's telling, had become her puppet. He was no longer a Roman hero but a fallen man, weakened by Eastern pleasures and soft silks. It was a careful story, built piece by piece. Cleopatra was said to hold feasts where she wasted gold, to wear jewels worth more than Roman temples, to sit on thrones of silver and command gods to bend to her will. These were not lies, but they were not whole truths either. Octavian exaggerated, distorted, and embellished, and in doing so he reshaped public opinion without lifting a blade. The Senate listened. The people nodded. How could Antony, once noble, now give Roman lands to a foreign queen? What spells had she cast? What charms had stolen his reason? Cleopatra became a symbol, not of power but of danger. A woman too clever, too proud, too rich in beauty and ambition. And worse still, she was not Roman. She spoke with an accent. She prayed to strange gods. Her children were born of both East and West, and to many that made them born of neither. Octavian's silence was loud. He did not declare war, not yet, but he fanned the flames of outrage. He let Rome grow restless. Every whisper against Cleopatra grew into a murmur, and every murmur into a speech. Soon Rome was not asking if there would be war, but when. Octavian understood something Antony did not, that in war, image can strike before armies, and Cleopatra's image was already burning across the Republic. The calm before Actium, The lovers build a dream palace of rule, unaware the sea is already stirring. Back in Egypt, the world felt distant. In the great city of Alexandria, under sapphire skies and the breath of sea winds, Antony and Cleopatra moved deeper into their shared dream. Their palace echoed with laughter, music, and the scent of blooming jasmine. Architects built new halls, artists painted frescoes of gods and stars. Philosophers were invited to speak. The twin children, now growing, played in marble courtyards, unaware of the storms taking shape beyond the horizon. Together, Antony and Cleopatra imagined a world balanced by two thrones, one in Rome, one in Alexandria, two centres of power bound by love and blood. They spoke of future victories, of the East rising in beauty and wisdom. They read poetry at night and discussed stars by day. And yet, beyond the silence of their carved walls, ships were being built, troops were gathering, and Rome's gaze was no longer curious, it was fixed with intent. The waters of the Mediterranean, calm and wide, began to carry news of coming war. But in Alexandria the days remained soft. Cleopatra prepared fleets with quiet confidence. Antony, though aware of Rome's anger, believed his veterans would stand by him. He still imagined loyalty, still hoped reason would prevail, but Octavian had already made his plans. The West would not forgive what it saw as betrayal, and soon that quiet sea would roar with iron and flame. For now, though, the lovers rested in their illusion. They watched the sun set from high balconies. They held their children close. They planned for peace in a world that had already chosen war. Their dreams were still alive, but the tide had already begun to turn, and in the distance the winds that would lead to Actium began to rise. Slowly, quietly, inevitable. Chapter 11. Actium, where dreams drown. The waters of the Ionian Sea were not still that morning. They moved with a restless shimmer, as though they sensed what was coming. It was the year 31 BCE, and off the coast of Greece 2 worlds were preparing to collide. One bore the golden standards of Cleopatra and Antony, lovers and leaders bound by passion and politics. The other carried the crest of a rising power, Octavian, heir of Caesar and master of Roman patience. This was not just a battle for land or fleets. This was a fight for the future itself. Antony's fleet was large but heavy, his warships were wide, hulking beasts with tall towers and thick planks that could take a battering. Cleopatra had brought 60 of her own ships, swift and elegant, painted with the colours of Egypt. Together, they floated like a single massive creature stretched across the blue, waiting to either strike or sink. Across the water, Octavian's Admiral Agrippa moved with quiet skill. His ships were lighter, faster, and drilled in sharp formations. He had the wind on his side and discipline in his ranks. Though outnumbered, his men knew the sea like it was home. They were not there for glory. They were there to end a threat. The morning wore on with silence, only broken by the distant slap of oars and the occasional cry of gulls. And then, movement. One ship pulled forward, then another. The 2 fleets inched closer, iron grinding against water, fire kindling in hearts that had long waited for this day. Then came the clash. Rams tore into hulls. Archers loosed their arrows. Firepots crashed onto decks, and plumes of smoke rose into the open sky. The sea became a battlefield, a churning mix of wood, flame, and blood. Antony's massive ships struggled to turn, though they were strong but slow. Agrippa's ships sliced through the chaos, darting in and out like wasps. They struck and retreated before their targets could respond. On the deck of her flagship, Cleopatra watched the violence unfold. Her eyes were steady, but her heart was storming. This was not just a war, it was the test of everything she had gambled her life on. The sea below did not care. It swallowed the brave and the cautious alike, pulling both kings and commoners into its cold, unfeeling depth. The turning of the ships. As the day moved past its peak, the wind shifted. The smoke grew heavier. The creak of broken masts and the cries of the wounded echoed across the waves. Cleopatra's ships, though untouched at first, were hemmed in by the tightening circle of Octavian's navy. She had to decide, fight to the end or flee and preserve what remained. Then, in a sudden sweep, her sails unfurled. Her flagship turned from the fight and began to cut through the sea, heading east back toward Egypt. The rest of her fleet followed like startled birds. The sight stunned everyone, friend and foe alike. From Antony's deck, the moment felt like betrayal. The Queen was leaving. His partner in love, in war, in destiny was gone. But Cleopatra's move was not reckless. It may have been the last clever gamble in a war already lost. She knew that if her ships were captured, Egypt would be defenseless. She had to protect her people, her throne, her legacy. Still, in the eyes of the Romans, and even in the hearts of some who fought for her, the retreat looked like cowardice. The sea whispered of abandonment. Antony, seeing her ship vanish into the horizon, felt something inside him crack. He gave chase, leaving his own command. His officers tried to call him back, begged him not to abandon the rest of the fleet, but he had made his choice. Love had pulled him once again into its current, away from duty, away from command, away from everything else. Behind them, the battle raged on. Without their leader, Antony's forces faltered. Confused and directionless, the great warships of the east became easy targets. Octavian's navy moved in with precision, setting more ships aflame, capturing others, and claiming the sea. The western tide had turned, Rome was winning, and yet as Cleopatra's ships slipped into the safety of open waters, a part of the battle's meaning changed. The war was no longer on the sea, it was inside the minds of those who watched the Queen disappear, a symbol of dreams vanishing into mist, the collapse of command. By nightfall, the sounds of war faded into silence. The sea held its breath. Antony's navy, leaderless and battered, had surrendered. Fires burned quietly on the horizon, reflecting in the darkening waves. The dream of an Eastern Empire had begun to dissolve, not in one final blow, but in the slow unravelling of loyalty, courage, and trust. In the days that followed, Octavian wasted no time. He solidified his control, praised Agrippa, and prepared for the next step. But for Antony, the silence after Actium was louder than war. He returned to Cleopatra in Egypt, alive but broken. The proud Roman general who had once held the East in his hand now arrived with only ashes and regret. Their reunion was not filled with anger. There were no shouting matches or bitter accusations. They had both lost. They had both made decisions shaped by fear and hope, by loyalty and love. And now they stood in the ruins of their shared ambition, clinging to one another like driftwood in a storm. The command structures of Antony's army began to crack. Officers defected, provinces switched sides, loyal governors in the eastern territories saw the writing on the wall and pledged themselves to Octavian. Even Egypt's defences began to wither. Antony tried to rally what forces remained. He held speeches. He promised revenge, rebirth, resurgence, but the fire in his voice no longer reached the hearts of his soldiers. The image of his ships burning at Actium had dimmed his light in their eyes. Cleopatra returned to her palace with a quiet resolve. She fortified the city. She prepared her son Caesarion for the future. She counted her ships, her treasures, her few remaining allies. But deep within, she too felt the tightening noose. The dream she had lived for, a strong sovereign of Egypt, standing alongside Rome as an equal, had been washed away in the tide. Ashes on the horizon. The months after Actium were a long farewell. Every day that passed felt like a slow-motion collapse. Messengers arrived with the news of betrayal. Allies fell away like dried leaves in the wind. Octavian, methodical and merciless, made his way toward Egypt. His armies moved over land and sea with quiet confidence. In Alexandria, the sun still rose and the streets still bustled, but a hush hung in the air. The people sensed the change. They had seen kings rise and fall before, but never had the queen looked so alone. Cleopatra walked her marble halls with grace, but her steps echoed with the weight of knowing. Antony tried once more to prepare for war. He built a final defense. He rode through the city, waving to the people, trying to show strength. But the sparkle in his eyes had gone dim. He knew that battles are not always lost by swords. Some are lost by silence, some by time. Then came the final blow. Octavian's navy entered Egyptian waters. The walls of safety that Cleopatra had once trusted crumbled like dust. The Mediterranean, which had once carried her in triumph to Tarsus and beyond, now brought the future with iron sails. Still, Cleopatra would not surrender easily. She dressed in royal garments, she visited temples, she reminded herself that queens do not beg. In public, she was still radiant. In private, she held her children close and stared long into the horizon, watching for what would come. They had returned to Egypt not as rulers, but as fugitives of fate. The sea that had once promised glory now whispered warnings. And yet, in the quiet before Rome's final arrival, there was a strange peace, a kind of acceptance. The dream was ending. But in its ending, a story was being born, one that would echo through history. A queen, a general, a love that tried to fight an empire, and a battle at sea where dreams drowned but did not disappear. Chapter 12, A Palace of Ghosts. The streets of Alexandria no longer rang with the echoes of music and wine. The once glittering capital, where silk flowed through open windows and honeyed words drifted through marbled halls, had become quiet. There was a stillness to the air, like the calm before a desert storm. Word had arrived. Octavian was coming. He was not a dream, not a threat from afar. He was a presence marching from the north with precision and no pause. His legions, hardened by years of battle and sharpened by ambition, were drawing closer by the hour. Along the Egyptian coast, towns folded into silence, either submitting or falling. There was no one left to resist him. Rome was now his to claim, and the East, that realm of gods and queens, was to be subdued. Cleopatra felt it in her bones. Not just a shift of power, but the cold unravelling of a world she had built piece by piece. The doors of the palace remained open, but few dared to enter. Servants moved like shadows. Advisors whispered and then vanished. Even the sun seemed hesitant to shine fully over the city. From the high balcony of her palace, Cleopatra could see the hazy horizon beyond the Nile's curve. That was where Octavian would appear. His flag would rise like a dark star over the city. He had not come with fire, but with silence. His strategy was not to destroy Alexandria, but to unmake it from within. Word spread that he had offered mercy to those who surrendered, yet nothing about him felt merciful. Cleopatra had once charmed the father, Julius Caesar, and stood beside the lover, Mark Antony. But Octavian was of a different breed. Young, cold, calculating. He did not seek Cleopatra's affection. He wanted her legacy erased. Antony wandered the palace in those days like a restless ghost, armoured not in bronze but in regret. He listened for news with a clenched jaw, pacing the columns of the great hall as if he could delay the inevitable. This was not how he imagined his last days, not beaten in battle, but surrounded by crumbling statues and broken dreams. Yet even in despair he refused to flee. This was their home, their kingdom, and if it was to fall, they would fall with it. Together. The lover's final gambit. Cleopatra did not wait idly. She was not a woman to surrender without a dance of possibility. One final attempt remained, not on the battlefield but behind closed doors. She sent emissaries northward, draped in silks and pearls, not with threats but with offerings. She promised treasures untouched, Egyptian gold hidden in sacred temples. She offered trade, titles, even her own crown. And when words were not enough, she tried myth, whispering that the goddess Isis still ruled Egypt, and to harm her would be to offend the gods. But Octavian did not flinch. The messengers returned empty, their eyes hollow with quiet dread. There would be no bargain. He did not want the crown. He wanted the queen, not as ruler or consort, but as a prisoner. Her throne was no longer her own. Her fate would be decided not by her voice, but by his hand. Still, Cleopatra played her final cards. She began to prepare a tomb, not in secret but openly, as a queen preparing for eternity. Word of it reached the city, a mausoleum built of marble and gold set beside the temple of the gods. Within it she gathered her most sacred objects, scrolls of philosophy, heirlooms of the Ptolemies, and the tokens of her love with Antony. But this was not just a tomb, it was a message. She would not be paraded through the streets of Rome. She would not become a spectacle for Octavian's triumph. If he would not allow her to live with dignity, she would die with it. Antony watched as she prepared it. He did not stop her. Deep down, he knew she was right. Their time had passed. Their empire, their love, once so bright, so fiery, had no place in the new Rome rising in the west. Yet part of him still held to the hope that battle might be joined, that perhaps somewhere in the chaos they might carve a way out. But the stars no longer aligned for them. The gods, it seemed, had turned their faces away. Antony's last sword. The final blow came with the cruelest of lies. A false report reached Antony. Cleopatra was dead. Whether it came from a traitor's lips or a desperate mistake, no one knows. But for Antony, it was the end. The moment the words reached him, something inside him broke. The part of him that had fought, loved, dreamed. He no longer had a reason to live. In his last hour, he did not rage. He did not weep. He simply asked to be alone. He took his sword, worn from too many campaigns, and found a quiet chamber where the sun filtered through thin drapes. The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses against the ears. He sat down for a moment, perhaps remembering the plains of Actium, the laughter of Cleopatra, the children who once climbed into his lap without knowing the weight he carried. Then, without ceremony, he fell upon his sword. The wound was deep, but it did not kill him instantly. He collapsed onto the cool stone floor, blood soaking the silken robes that once marked him a Roman hero. His breathing grew shallow, his vision blurred, and still she did not come. But Cleopatra was not dead. The news reached her as a scream, tearing through the stillness of her chamber. She rushed to him, not as a queen, but as a woman. Guards stepped aside, servants fell to their knees. She found him lying there, the scent of iron in the air, the colour draining from his face. She cradled him in her arms, whispering words the world would never hear. Perhaps they were apologies, perhaps they were promises, or perhaps they were simply the same vow repeated over and over. I am here, I am here. The end of the Roman flame, Mark Antony died in Cleopatra's arms. Not on a battlefield, not in a triumph, but quietly in a city that once loved him and now awaited its conqueror. His final words were not of glory or ambition, but of her. He whispered that he had not been a perfect man, but he had loved perfectly, that even as Rome turned its back on him, her eyes never did. He told her she must not trust Octavian. He knew what awaited her if she did. And then he slipped away, not with fanfare, but with a sigh. The palace fell deeper into shadow. The corridors that had once echoed with laughter now held only silence. Cleopatra dressed in mourning, though no cloth could match the grief that clung to her heart. She watched from her window as Octavian's banners rose just beyond the city walls. He had arrived, but Cleopatra had already made her decision. She would not be chained and paraded. She would not stand on the steps of the Senate as a conquered queen. Her life had been lived as a symbol of Egypt, of resistance, of love, and so her death would be the same. She withdrew to the tomb she had built, taking with her 2 loyal handmaidens and a basket concealed in linens. Some say it carried figs, others say a snake was hidden within, the sacred asp, long associated with royalty and divine death. Whatever the truth, by the time Octavian breached the palace gates, it was too late. He found her laid upon a golden couch, her crown beside her, her eyes closed like a painting come to life. Her handmaidens lay nearby, faithful even in death. Octavian looked upon the scene not with anger, but with a strange quiet. He had won, the war was over, but something in Cleopatra's final act haunted him. She had denied him his triumph, she had written her shedding in her own ink. And so the Roman flame flickered out, not with swords, not with fire, but in a palace of ghosts. The love that had shaken empires now rested in silence. The queen who had defied the world chose to vanish on her own terms, and in the hush that followed, Alexandria wept. Chapter 13. The Serpent's Kiss. The sun fell heavy over Alexandria. Its streets, once buzzing with merchants and scholars, had gone quiet. Dust clung to the air, and the once glorious palace walls held only whispers of what had been. Roman banners now fluttered over towers that once bore Cleopatra's crest. The queen, long proud, long unyielding, was no longer ruler in name, but in spirit she had not surrendered. Octavian's forces had entered the city with grim efficiency. There had been little resistance left. With Mark Antony's death, by his own sword wounded and mourned in Cleopatra's arms, the heart of their rebellion had stopped beating. Octavian, cold and calculating, was not one to waste time. He marched into Alexandria as a conqueror, yet his triumph felt incomplete. Cleopatra had been taken into custody, not as a mere prisoner, but as a living relic of a dying dynasty. She was watched, guarded, but not harmed. Octavian knew her value. In Rome, her presence would mean spectacle. He pictured her paraded in chains, humiliated before the Senate. offered up to the people as the spoils of Egypt. But Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, did not see herself as spoils. Her spirit, fierce and sharp, still burned beneath the veils and silence. In private, she kept her dignity close. She spoke little, ate little, and rarely showed fear. She mourned Antony not as a fallen general, but as the other half of her war-torn soul. Yet she did not break. Not when her kingdom fell, not when Rome closed in, not even when Octavian came to her in person, offering words laced with false comfort. There is something a conqueror cannot take: choice. And Cleopatra knew this. The world could strip away her palace, her lovers, her armies, but her ending? That would be hers to write. The refusal to be paraded. The idea of being paraded through Roman streets, shackled and stared at like an exotic beast, was more than humiliation. It was erasure. Cleopatra knew the fate of those before her. Defeated kings, queens, and leaders, dragged behind chariots, mocked and jeered, their final legacy written by the hands of their enemies. Octavian made it clear, if she lived, she would be his prize. She would be taken to Rome and displayed during his triumph, the great celebration of his conquest. But Cleopatra had lived as more than a ruler. She had lived as a symbol of Egypt, of power, of beauty, of defiance. She would not let that image be torn apart in front of strangers who had never knelt to her. In the quiet of her chamber, she began to plan. Those close to her could see it in her eyes, not desperation, but decision. She asked for her final rites, as a queen should. She dressed not in mourning black, but in royal linen and gold. Her body bore no chains, only the weight of her choices. Octavian grew uneasy. He sent word demanding that she remain alive. He had her children, her servants, her future in his hands, but Cleopatra did not flinch. She had known all along that the price of ruling alone, of loving boldly, was steep. But she had also learned that some acts echo louder than armies. She would not walk through Rome's streets. She would not be a puppet for Octavian's glory. She would vanish on her own terms, wrapped in legend rather than rope. The bite of the divine. What happened next has been told in many ways. Some say she held a small serpent to her breast, an asp sacred to the goddess Isis. Others speak of poison in a vial hidden in a comb or a hollowed hairpin. There are tales of a basket of figs, with death curled between the fruit. But in truth, no one knows the exact moment or the exact method. What remains clear is this: Cleopatra chose the end. Her attendants, loyal to the last, helped her prepare. They were found beside her, lifeless, dressed in ceremonial robes. The chamber was still, a hush drawn over marble floors and silk cushions. There was no struggle, no cry, just the quiet breath of decision. When Octavian's men entered the room, it was too late. Cleopatra lay serene, adorned in gold, with a calmness that unnerved even hardened soldiers. The serpent, if there was one, was gone. Some said its bite left marks near her heart. Others found none, but the symbol was stronger than the proof. She had once called herself the living embodiment of Isis, the Divine Mother, and in the eyes of many she died like a goddess, mysterious, powerful, beyond the grasp of men who sought to cage her. Even in death, Cleopatra remained unknowable. Octavian's victory, though complete in war, rang hollow in spirit. He had wanted her to kneel. She had vanished instead, slipping into legend like a whisper in the wind. The queen ascends. Cleopatra's death was not an ending. It was the beginning of a story that would never quite end. For centuries, poets, painters, and emperors would retell the tale. Was she a temptress or a tragic heroine? A villain or a visionary? No one could agree, but all agreed she was unforgettable. Her tomb, built with Antony's, was never found. Some say Octavian allowed them to be buried together, honouring their love in the end. Others believe the tomb was hidden, lost to time, swept under the sands or beneath modern cities. Whatever the truth, the absence of her resting place only deepened the myth. She became more than a queen. She became a symbol of beauty, of ambition, of the price of power. Her children lived, but their future was shaped by Rome. Egypt, once ruled by the line of the Ptolemies, fell fully into Roman hands. The age of pharaohs ended, but Cleopatra's name lingered. In plays, her words echoed. In paintings, her face looked back with sorrow and strength. In every whisper of the Nile, there was a trace of her voice. To some, she was the last pharaoh. to others the last dream of an independent Egypt. But to those who listened closely, she was something more, a woman who refused to be rewritten, even by the hands of an empire. She met her end not as a victim, but as an author. With a serpent's kiss, she stepped beyond history and into myth, leaving behind a trail that no conqueror could erase. Chapter 14. The Fall of the Pharaohs. He was called Caesarion, Little Caesar, the only known son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. In him, two worlds had once seemed to unite, Rome and Egypt, empire and kingdom, god and goddess. But as the sun set on Alexandria and Roman ships darkened the harbours, there was no protection left for the boy king. After Cleopatra's death, he had been urged to flee, guided along dusty roads and secret paths toward the safety of the southern lands, perhaps even toward India. But Roman eyes were everywhere, and Octavian's orders were cold and clear. No rival blood must remain. Caesarion was captured near the Nile, still a teenager, still holding the hope of a crown he never wore. There was no trial, no ceremony, and no farewell. History gives us few details, only a breathless line written by the victors. Too many Caesars is not a good thing. The blade fell quietly, and with it, the last true king of Egypt. In that silent act, the ancient lineage that stretched back thousands of years, through the Ptolemies, through the pharaohs, through myth, was cut. Caesarion died not in a blaze of glory, but in the soft, dark folds of history's forgetting. And yet, in that quiet corner of time, a chapter closed with a final breath. A boy once born of gods and queens faded like the last flicker of a once burning star. The children of the moon. Cleopatra had other children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. After the fall of Egypt, they were not hidden, not lost, but paraded through the streets of Rome. No longer children of the sun and moon, they were children of defeat. Octavian, now Augustus, used them as trophies, symbols of his conquest over Egypt, over Antony, over the East itself. They walked beneath Roman arches, dressed in foreign silks, staring at crowds that cheered their mother's downfall. Yet Rome did not kill them, it had no need. Their power had been drained, their crowns stripped. They were placed into the care of Octavia, the sister of Augustus and the once wife of Mark Antony. In her home, they grew not as heirs, but as shadows of a forgotten dynasty. Ptolemy Philadelphus vanishes from history, perhaps taken by illness, perhaps buried without record. Alexander Helios, named after the sun, disappeared into silence. Only Cleopatra Selene, child of the moon, endured. She was married to Juba, a prince of Numidia raised in Rome, and together they ruled Mauritania, a distant corner of Africa, Roman in name but faintly echoing older traditions. Cleopatra Selene bore children, wore a crown and lit her courts with the memory of her mother's pride. Yet she too would die within the grasp of the empire, her lineage folded into Roman maps, her children speaking Latin names. The stars that once aligned in Egyptian skies had scattered, each dimmed, each drifting away from the land that bore them. The death of a civilization. Cleopatra's death was not just the end of a queen, it was the end of a world. Egypt, once the mightiest kingdom on earth, became a province. It did not fall in thunder or fire, but in surrender, quiet and complete. No army defended the ancient temples, no priest rose to declare war. The Ptolemaic throne, occupied for 300 years, simply disappeared. And behind it, deeper still, the soul of pharaonic Egypt, the legacy of thousands of years, was quietly extinguished. The Romans brought governors, not gods. They brought laws written in Latin, not carved into stone with sacred symbols. They taxed the farmers, drained the granaries, and built roads across sands that once shimmered beneath pyramids. Alexandria, still rich with libraries and marble streets, was no longer the heartbeat of a kingdom but an asset of an empire. Pharaoh, once a divine word, became a memory. Temples once alive with incense and chants were shuttered or repurposed. The gods were forgotten by degrees, replaced by Jupiter, Mars, and the slow march of Roman reason. Egypt's old voice, the one that had whispered through sphinxes and sung through lotus fields, was fading. Its Its power had not been conquered in battle, but absorbed, reimagined, overwritten. Cleopatra had been the last thread tying Egypt to its ancient self, and with her gone, the civilization was folded into a story it did not write. The Nile still flowed, the sun still rose, but the age of the pharaohs was no more. The quiet of the Nile, and so the Nile flowed on. It did not stop for queens or armies. It did not mourn. It simply moved as it always had, carrying silt and stories from one season into the next. Along its banks, fishermen still cast their nets, unaware that an empire had changed hands. Children still played in the reeds, and in the hush of early morning, priests still walked into shadowed temples, now echoing and empty. The chants had grown softer, the offerings fewer. The gods, once praised by thousands, now stood alone in the dim light, their eyes fixed on a world that no longer called their names. Some temples were closed, others were left to crumble. Statues of Isis, Horus, and Osiris watched silently as vines crept over stone and wind carried away their prayers. The scribes stopped writing in hieroglyphs. The language of the sacred became a mystery even to those who lived beneath its gaze. In time, even the names of gods were misremembered, their stories reduced to myth, then to nothing. But the Nile kept its rhythm. It did not weep for Cleopatra nor rage at Rome. It flowed through the land with an ancient calm, as if to remind the world that some things endure not in power but in presence. Egypt was no longer a kingdom, but it remained a place of memory, a land where the wind still stirred among ruins and the stones still whispered in the hush of night. And perhaps, if one listened closely, in the space between the waves, in the hush after the wind, one could still hear her, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, speaking softly to the gods that once were, as the stars drifted above the water, and the Nile carried her story ever onward, into the folds of time. Chapter 15. A Legend. Rewritten. History has long cast Cleopatra in a narrow light. In paintings, poems, and plays, she is the Siren Queen, seducing powerful Roman men, bringing empires to ruin with her beauty. Her face is said to have launched 1,000 ships, her voice to have made generals weak. But this story, while captivating, is only a sliver of who she truly was. It is a version shaped by outsiders, simplified for spectacle. The myth of Cleopatra as merely a seductress has followed her for centuries. It has reduced her reign to romance, her power to appearance. Yet the woman herself ruled one of the most important kingdoms in the ancient world for over 2 decades, through times of great crisis. She did not do so with beauty alone, nor was that even her primary strength. The focus on her charm, her affairs, her dramatic end, these details have always outshone her strategic mind and political skill. The seductress myth flattens her legacy into a tale of personal desire, ignoring her careful diplomacy, her knowledge of multiple languages, her grasp of complex political tides. It is easier, perhaps, to tell a story of love and downfall than one of intellect and rule. But as we look closer, the old myth begins to dissolve, and the real Cleopatra begins to rise, brilliant, bold, and deeply misunderstood. Plutarch and propaganda. Much of what we know about Cleopatra comes from Roman sources, and the Romans had little interest in painting her fairly. Writers like Plutarch and Dio Cassius lived long after her death, writing for Roman audiences who saw her as the enemy. Plutarch in particular shaped the story that would echo for centuries. His accounts emphasized her allure, her manipulation of Caesar and Antony, her exotic nature. To Roman readers, she was a foreign threat, dangerous not with armies, but with seduction. She symbolized the East, opulent, cunning, and morally suspect. These were not unbiased portraits. They were tools of propaganda. Rome had to justify its wars, its conquests, its punishments. Cleopatra, as Queen of Egypt, stood in opposition to the Roman order. And so the pens of Roman historians turned her into a villainess. Even her death, by snakebite, so the story goes, was told with dramatic flair, fitting the image they had already crafted. In truth, Roman chroniclers were less concerned with Cleopatra herself and more concerned with the men who tangled with her. To explain Caesar's favoritism, Antony's downfall, and Octavian's rise, they needed her to be a temptress. The truth, more complex, more human, was buried beneath political storytelling. and for generations readers believed what they read. The real Cleopatra became a ghost behind Roman words. The woman behind the veil. Modern historians working with archaeology, linguistics, and ancient Egyptian sources have started to uncover a different Cleopatra. This Cleopatra is not the fantasy of Roman fear, but a ruler of great intelligence and capability. She spoke many languages, possibly as many as 9. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn Egyptian, a sign of her deep engagement with her people. She studied medicine, philosophy, mathematics. She was known to correspond with scholars and theologians across cultures. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was a leader in the full sense, active in military planning, economic policy, and religious life. During her reign, Egypt was under immense pressure from Rome and internal threats. Yet she managed the economy, reformed currency, navigated famine, and secured temporary peace through alliances and negotiations. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were not simply romantic entanglements, but political strategies in a world dominated by men and empires. Each alliance was a calculated move aimed at protecting her kingdom and maintaining its independence. These were choices made by a ruler balancing survival against overwhelming odds. Far from the idle courtesan of Roman imagination, Cleopatra was constantly working, thinking, adapting. In Alexandria, her court was one of the last beacons of Hellenistic culture, lending Greek and Egyptian traditions, ideas, and art. Her image on coin showed strength, not softness. Her titles emphasized divinity, not desire. The woman behind the veil of history is someone far more formidable and far more fascinating than legend has allowed. A story reclaimed. In the quiet corners of museums, the dust of time is being carefully brushed away. On worn papyri and chipped stone, the name Cleopatra is being rewritten, not by conquerors, but by scholars. Slowly, her story is coming into focus. Plays like Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra are now seen less as truth and more as reflections of their own time, echoing Roman bias, wrapped in Renaissance drama. Modern biographies, academic studies, and documentaries paint a richer portrait. Cleopatra is emerging not as a fantasy, but as a tactician, a woman who used every tool available to defend her people, her throne, her culture. Her life was not a tragedy of love lost, but a testament to leadership in a world built to resist her. She outlasted rivals, made alliances that bought precious time, and ruled longer than most queens or kings of her age. Even in death, her image was shaped by those who feared her strength. But now, new generations are meeting her differently. In classrooms, she is taught as a scientist, a scholar, a stateswoman. In libraries, her voice is heard not in whispers of seduction, but in strategies and statecraft. The myth fades, the real woman rises, and in the gentle turning of the pages, we reclaim Cleopatra, not as a figure of fantasy, but as a symbol of resilience, intellect, and quiet power. The story was never simple. It was never only about beauty. It was about survival, brilliance, and the burden of ruling in a time of rising empires. As the stars move over the Nile, her name no longer floats in scandal, but in legacy. The legend is rewritten, and at last, it feels true. Chapter 16. Cleopatra Through the Ages. Long after her death, Cleopatra never faded from the world's imagination. Instead, she grew brighter in the minds of artists, poets, and dreamers who needed a face for their longing. In the golden silence of Renaissance studios, her image came to life again, painted not as a ruler of the Nile, but as a symbol of mystery and seduction. Michelangelo never drew her, yet his vision of womanhood, powerful, curved, and commanding, carried her spirit. Others followed with more direct strokes. In 18th century Venice, Giovanni Battista Tiepolo painted Cleopatra with flushed cheeks and flowing silks, surrounded by Roman generals and golden light. She did not look Egyptian in these works. Her skin was pale, her features European, but that was the point. The artists weren't showing us who Cleopatra was, they were showing us who they wanted her to be. She became the painted queen of Western fantasy. In some portraits, she looked like a martyr, gazing upward, with the asp coiled at her breast, as if death were an act of noble defiance. In others, she lounged in exotic interiors, half draped, eyes half closed, as if seduction were her true kingdom. Always she was framed in softness, pillows, perfumes, and golden shadows. Artists did not paint the strategist or the queen who spoke 9 languages. They painted a dream, a whisper, a woman lost in time. To them, Cleopatra was not history. She was mood, symbol, myth, something to project desire upon. The further away from her real story the painters moved, the more deeply they believed in the story they create. That is the strange thing about myth. It can feel more real than fact. The Cleopatra on the canvas didn't rule empires, but she ruled imaginations, and for many, that was power enough. Shakespeare's tragic muse. When William Shakespeare set his pen to parchment, Cleopatra rose again, not on marble steps or painted walls, but in living breath. His tragedy Antony and Cleopatra brought her to the stage not just as a figure of beauty, but as a force of contradiction. Here was a queen who wept and laughed, who wielded power and flirted with ruin, often in the same moment. She became Shakespeare's most complex woman, not just a lover, not just a monarch, but both at once, and always she was tragic. In Shakespeare's telling, Cleopatra is sharp and dazzling, quick to anger and quicker to charm. She mocks Antony, she mourns him. She toys with messengers and defies Roman coldness with Egyptian heat. She is not passive, she moves the plot forward with her choices. Yet her fate is sealed from the beginning. The audience knows this. Still they watch because Cleopatra in Shakespeare's hands is more than a character. She is drama itself. Her language is music. She calls herself fire and air and says that after her death, the elements will melt. She believes in the divinity of her love and in the eternity of her pain. To the Elizabethans who watched men play her on candlelit stages, she was a reflection of empire, danger, and loss. England had its own powerful queen, Elizabeth I, and Cleopatra became both a parallel and a warning. Love might undo a queen, power might cost the heart. Shakespeare captured that tension in line after line. But even he, the great bard, filtered Cleopatra through the desires of his time. His Cleopatra is shaped by male eyes, desirable, deadly, defiant. He does not give her solitude or the quiet strength of her younger years. Instead, he gives her a stage to burn upon. And so she became not just a muse, but a mirror, a way for audiences to gaze into history and see their own fears reflected back. Hollywood's Cleopatra. Centuries passed. Art changed, empires fell, but Cleopatra remained. Then came the age of cinema, a new kind of storytelling, made of light and sound. And Hollywood, with its hunger for grandeur, reached back to Egypt. It found in Cleopatra a ready-made legend, a queen who loved, lost, and died spectacularly. She was perfect for the screen. The most famous of these visions came in 1963, when Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra in a film of unmatched extravagance. The production was enormous, more expensive than any movie before it. The sets were vast, built to echo the palaces of Alexandria. The costumes sparkled, each one more elaborate than the last. Elizabeth Taylor wore golden headdresses, emerald gowns, and enough eyeliner to be seen from the next city. But it wasn't just the visuals, it was the idea. Cleopatra as ultimate woman, ultimate queen. This Cleopatra walked through clouds of incense. She tamed men with glances. She spoke softly, but always with weight. She was spectacle, and that was what the world wanted. In the Cold War era, with tensions high and identity shifting, people longed for beauty and escape. Cleopatra offered both. The film may not have followed history, but it followed fantasy, and for many that was enough. Yet Hollywood's Cleopatra was not all glimmer. Beneath the costumes, Elizabeth Taylor gave her vulnerability. She cried, she feared, she held Antony's dying body with real sorrow. For a moment, the screen softened. The queen became human again. Still, the film's legacy was one of grandeur. It left behind an image, Cleopatra as the woman who could bring Rome to its knees and wear diamonds while doing so. But with each new film or miniseries, the question returned. Who was the real Cleopatra? Was she queen or courtesan? Genius or temptress? Or something beyond those labels? Hollywood never answered. It only offered her again, like a jewel held to the light, ever-changing, always brilliant. A mirror for our myths. The truth is simple and strange. Cleopatra has become less a person, more a canvas. Each generation paints her anew. In paintings, she is soft and sacred. In plays, she is fire. In films, she is spectacle. But all of these Cleopatras tell us more about ourselves than about her. During the Enlightenment, she was mocked by some scholars who saw women as emotional and weak. In the Romantic era, she was praised as a doomed soul full of beauty and death. In feminist circles, she has been reclaimed as a strategist and survivor, a woman who navigated a world built against her. She wears every mask history gives her, yet never vanishes beneath them. That is her mystery. That is her power. We do not know the colour of her skin, the sound of her voice, or the shape of her thoughts. But we feel her, across centuries, across oceans. Her story echoes because it is not just about one woman. It is about power and love, loss and pride. It is about how history forgets and remembers its women. Cleopatra is remembered not because the Romans wrote about her, but because artists kept dreaming her back into being. Even now she appears in poems, in novels, in debates. She lives in museums and hashtags, in costume parties and college lectures. Sometimes she is mocked, sometimes she is honoured, but always she is watched. We look at her to see ourselves, our fears, our hunger, our myths, and somewhere in that gaze Cleopatra watches back. She was born in Alexandria. She ruled a fractured world. She died with dignity, her final act wrapped in legend. But her story did not end in that tomb. It began again and again, with every eye that saw her not as she was, but as we needed her to be. And still, through the shimmer of oil paint and cinema and ink, her real presence gleams, distant but unforgotten, like a star through smoke. Chapter 17, Symbols and Sorrows. The sun had not yet risen over Alexandria, but already the city stirred with the quiet ache of ending. Wind moved gently through the empty halls of the palace, brushing past columns carved with stories too old to fully remember. Here, within those fading walls, Cleopatra walked, no longer a queen adorned in splendour, but a woman carrying the weight of a world about to vanish. The Ptolemaic dynasty, once proud and firm in its hold on Egypt, had become a house with cracked foundations, each stone pressed by the power of Rome and the passage of time. Cleopatra was not just a ruler of her people, she had become their final thread to something sacred and old. In her veins flowed not only royal blood, but the memory of Egypt's gods, their rituals, their temples, their belief that time moved in circles, not lines. The Nile had always given life to the land, just as the gods had given meaning to that life. But now the waters still ran, and yet something had changed, something deeper than politics or armies. It was as if the soul of Egypt had begun to slip away, and Cleopatra, in all her fierce brilliance, stood in the middle of it, trying to hold it still. She bore children who were meant to carry forward a legacy. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was crowned in Alexandria as the rightful ruler of Egypt, and later her children with Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were given kingdoms carved from hope and ambition. But none of them would inherit what truly mattered, not the deep magic of the temples, not the reverence of the people, not the belief that Egypt, even in its silence, could stand apart from the world beyond its deserts. To be Cleopatra was to be mother to more than just children. She was mother to a dying religion, a fading language, a sacred way of being that had lasted for 3,000 years. And yet, she could not stop the sands from shifting. Rome was rising with hands stretched wide, not to cradle Egypt, but to consume it. And she, once so powerful, found herself watching over something she could not save. In the stillness of her final years, surrounded by advisors, lovers, and dreams that no longer had room to grow, Cleopatra remained unbowed. But inside, the sorrow of being the last queen, last priestess, last hope, settled deep, like dust on the forgotten scrolls. A goddess in chains. Her identity as Isis incarnate, real or constructed, reflected the people's yearning for salvation. From her earliest days, Cleopatra had understood the power of symbol. Egypt was not ruled with gold alone, it was ruled with stories, with sacred images, with the idea that kings and queens were not just people but bridges between the human and the divine. And so Cleopatra did what every true pharaoh before her had done. She became more than mortal in the eyes of her people. She aligned herself with Isis, the ancient goddess of motherhood, magic, and protection. Isis was beloved across the land. She had mourned her slain husband Osiris, gathered the pieces of his broken body, and through sacred words brought him back to life. She was the goddess who grieved, who healed, who gave birth to the god Horus, the avenger of his father. And so Cleopatra too became a mother, a mourner, and a restorer of legacy. Whether she believed herself to be Isis, or simply wore the image like armour, it hardly mattered. To the people, the message was clear. The queen was divine. In ceremonies and on temple walls, she stood wrapped in linen and gold, crowned with the lunar disk and the horns of Hathor Isis, her eyes lined with the sacred green of malachite. The priests called her the daughter of Ra, one of the gods. And for a time it worked. In the age of conquest, when so much was uncertain, Cleopatra gave her people something eternal to believe in. But divinity, like power, can be a prison. As the Roman Empire grew bolder, the image of Cleopatra as Isis became a threat. To the west, she was no longer a queen or a goddess. She was a sorceress, a seductress, a woman who had wrapped mighty men in her spell and dared to challenge the order of things. Rome could not control what it could not understand, and in Cleopatra's divine femininity, they saw danger. A woman who could be both tender and fierce, who could lead armies and cradle children, who could command ships and offer sacrifices to gods that refused to die. And so her chains began to form, not made of iron, but of stories. Roman poets mocked her as wild and exotic. Leaders feared her influence. Even as her temple presence faded, the whispers grew, and while her people still bowed in devotion, those who came to conquer her did not kneel, they scoffed. By the end, the image of Isis remained, but the goddess behind it had been pushed into a corner. Cleopatra, once seen as the divine mother, now faced the limits of mortal flesh. Her titles still echoed through the halls, but the gods had grown quiet, and the woman who had walked with stars above her crown now stood in the shadows of empire. Grief etched in gold. Her downfall became a symbol of colonization, of memory, and of myth. Cleopatra's end came not with a clash of armies, but with the soft closing of a tomb door. As Octavian's forces entered Alexandria, she made a final decision, one that would echo louder than any battle. Her death, whether by snakebite or poisoned ointment, became a legend, and legends, unlike lives, cannot be buried. In her final moment, she chose not to be paraded through Rome like a trophy. She refused to be made into someone else's victory, and in that quiet defiance she preserved something sacred, her own story, even as others tried to rewrite it. But history, especially history written by victors, is rarely kind. Rome told its version, one that painted her as a manipulator, a foreign queen who had ensnared their heroes. In their scrolls, Cleopatra was reduced to romance and ruin. Her intellect, her rulership, her devotion to Egypt all faded beneath tales of seduction. And yet something else happened too. As Rome conquered Egypt, taking its treasures, its temples, and its children, Cleopatra became more than a queen who died. She became a symbol of what was lost. To those who looked back, she came to represent the end of something beautiful, the last sovereign of the Nile. The final whisper of an empire ruled not by brute force, but by sacred rhythm. Artists would paint her for centuries, always between light and shadow. Writers would tell her story again and again, each time searching for the woman behind the myth. In gold jewellery and stone statues, her face would survive, elegant, proud, unreadable. And in every retelling there was grief. Grief for a civilization absorbed into another. Grief for a queen who tried to stand alone against the tide. Grief for a world that measured time by the flooding of the river, not the march of legions. Cleopatra's story is not just hers. It belongs to every nation that watched its gods fall silent, to every culture swallowed by empire, to every woman whose power was feared more than it was understood. Her sorrow is carved into the pages of time, but it glows too, like gold that refuses to tarnish. A queen for the ages, she reigns still in literature, in longing, in the unbroken whispers of the Nile. Cleopatra may have vanished from her her temples, her city, but she did not vanish from the world. Like the river she loved, her story bends and turns, flowing into new lands, new tongues, new hearts. In the centuries that followed, her image reappeared again and again. In plays, she was the tragic lover. In poems, the eternal muse. In revolutions, a symbol of resistance. And in every retelling, something of her endured, not just the facts but the feeling, the sense that she had once stood at the edge of something immense and dared to be more than the world allowed. Writers from Rome to the Renaissance, from Shakespeare to modern screenplays, searched for her soul. Some saw her as a warning, others as a vision of grace and strength, but always she remained captivating, not because of how she died, but because of how she lived, with depth, with daring, and with love for a world that was vanishing beneath her feet. And if you walk now along the banks of the Nile, you might still feel her, in the rustle of papyrus reeds, in the scent of warm stone, in the hush that falls over the water at dusk, when the sun dips low and the world seems to hold its breath. She is not gone, not really. She is woven into the land, into memory, into every whispered prayer, for something sacred that will not be forgotten. Cleopatra was the end of one world, but she became the beginning of another. A world of legend, of longing, of lessons still unfolding. And so she remains, not just as history, but as heart. In the quiet spaces of night, when the world is ready to listen, her voice returns, soft as wind, steady as the tide. A queen, a goddess, a sorrow, a symbol, a story still being told. Chapter 18. The Nile. Still remembers. The Nile has never stopped flowing. It moves with the same rhythm it did when Cleopatra stood upon its banks, watching the sun rise over golden reeds and limestone temples. The river, older than kingdoms, older than stories, carries the memories of those who lived and ruled beside it. Cleopatra's reign, with all its beauty, tragedy and complexity, now lives beneath the surface, subtle, gliding, and deeply embedded in the flow of time. Her crown, though long buried, is reflected in the shimmer of the water at dusk, when the sky turns to amber and the wind hums like a distant hymn. The Nile knew her well. It had known the pharaohs before her, kings who claimed to be gods and priests who spoke to stars. But Cleopatra was something different. She did not only inherit Egypt, she embodied it. Her mind was sharp, her voice steady, her presence magnetic. And though the world around her grew more Roman, more foreign, she stayed rooted in the spirit of the river. The Nile had watched her birth in Alexandria's palace halls, its current cradling her youth. It bore witness to her greatest hopes and her deepest grief. When she reached out across the Mediterranean to Rome, the Nile was the thread that tied her always to home. The river was both crown and witness. It saw her wrapped in silks, sailing down its waters with Caesar, and later with Antony, where the boat shimmered with gold and the scent of lotus blossoms lingered in the air. But it also felt her fear, her desperation, her solitude in those final days. The same river that reflected her triumphs quietly mourned her fall, yet still it carries her, not in tears or in ruins, but in silence. The Nile does not forget. It moves slowly, like memory, like legend. Even now, as the world turns and centuries pass, Cleopatra's name returns with the current. In every glint of sun on the water's surface, in the rustle of papyrus, in the quiet pulse of the land, she is there, not as a ghost, but as a song the Nile sings without end. Echoes in the sand walk through Egypt today, and her name still lingers in the air. The streets of modern Alexandria bustle with life, but underneath the dust and stone something ancient waits. The ruins do not speak in words, but they remember. In temple walls, carved with stories, in the broken statues softened by time, in the sand itself, there are echoes, and often they whisper her name. Archaeologists search still for her tomb. Some say it lies near the ancient temple of Taposiris Magna, where the goddess Isis was once worshipped. Others think it was lost to the sea, swallowed by time and tide. But perhaps Cleopatra never needed a tomb, not in the way others did. Perhaps the land itself became her resting place. The desert holds her breath, the river her memory, and the wind carries fragments of her voice across the dunes. In museums across the world, her image lives on. Coins stamped with her profile, writings of Roman poets, sculptures chipped by centuries. But here in Egypt, she is more than art or artifact. She is a legend half sung by fishermen along the Nile. She is a queen imagined in school books and celebrated in plays. Children hear her name before they learn what history means. An older generation still tells stories of her beauty, her brilliance, her downfall. These are not just tales, they are a way of remembering. Not all ruins are made of stone. Some live in hearts, in dreams passed down like heirlooms. Cleopatra belongs to this deeper kind of memory. She survives not just because of what she did, but because of what she meant. In her, Egypt stood tall one last time before the empire was swallowed by Rome. In her, people see a woman who dared to hold the world in her hands. And even in failure, she shines. She walks the edge of myth and memory now. Her face, shaped by rumour and poetry, is not always clear. But her spirit, that remains, buried not under sand but inside it, carried in whispers, remembered in silence. What the world forgot. Cleopatra has often been reduced to a symbol, a seductress, a tragic queen, a pawn in Roman games. But that is not who she was. What the world forgot, or chose to forget, is that Cleopatra was a ruler first, a thinker, a strategist, a scholar fluent in many tongues, including the sacred language of the priests. She was the only Ptolemaic monarch to learn the Egyptian tongue, to speak to her people in their own voice. That mattered. She was not simply draped in silk and gold. She wore the burden of a collapsing world and still stood tall. Surrounded by foreign powers, held in the shadows of Rome's ambition, she fought not for herself alone, but for Egypt. She built ships, she minted currency, she guided law and led armies. Every decision, every alliance, every risk, these were acts of sovereignty. Of love for her land, she did not dream small. But history, especially written by victors, tends to shrink women like her, to turn power into seduction and wisdom into manipulation. They remembered her beauty and forgot her mind. They repeated tales of her love affairs and overlooked her rule. They told stories of her suicide but not of her survival. What the world forgot is the fire behind her crown, the resolve in her eyes, the sleepless nights spent navigating politics more tangled than any war. They forgot the pressure of being both queen and mother, both symbol and soul. Cleopatra was more than a queen. She was a world, one built on ancient tradition and shaped by her unique vision. And yet she remains misunderstood, not because she hid herself, but because the world saw only what it wanted. Now, as time softens old narratives, a new image rises, one truer, fuller, more human, one that honours not only her beauty, but her brilliance, not only her fall, but her strength. This too is part of her legacy, one that still waits to be fully seen. The endless rain. Night falls slowly over the Nile. The air cools, the sky darkens into indigo, and the stars appear one by one, soft and ancient. The river reflects the moon like a mirror, broken only by gentle ripples. And in this quiet, it feels as though time has folded in on itself. Cleopatra is gone, but the world she touched still breathes. There is something eternal about her story, something that refuses to settle, to fade. Perhaps because she was never meant to end, perhaps because some spirits are too vast, too vivid, to be sealed in a tomb or tucked away in a history book. Her reign, though broken by a war and wrapped in sorrow, never truly stopped. It lingers in the way her name is spoken, in the art she inspired, in the way we look at power and beauty, intellect and vulnerability, all woven into one life, and in every painting, every film, every poem that tries to imagine her, something new is added. And so she changes, not in truth but in legacy. She becomes not just the Queen of Egypt, but a mirror for the world, reflecting our questions, our dreams, our fears. This is not decay, it is transformation. The moon kisses the Nile now, silver and still. Somewhere not far from this river she once walked. She once breathed this same air. And though her palace has crumbled, her voice has not. It lives in wind, in water, in wonder. She is not gone. She has become something else, an echo that never ends. So we close our eyes, not on her death, but on her becoming. She is legend, she is longing. She is the song the Nile still sings, even now, even always.